The bullet was already in the air when Mark Ellison made his choice: save a stranger or save himself. What happened next didn't just stop a robbery, it rewrote two lives completely. I'm about to tell you a story about a single father who walked into a bank for a paycheck and walked out a hero, only to discover the woman he saved would soon be signing his. This is a true testament to how one split-second decision can change everything. Before we dive in, do me a favor. Comment below with your city or country so I can see how far this story travels. And stick with me until the end, because what happens in the final moments will absolutely blow your mind. Now let's go back to that Friday morning when Mark Ellison's ordinary life shattered like glass. The fluorescent lights of Crestline Bank hummed with their usual Friday morning indifference, casting pale white across the marble floor that Mark Ellison had just stepped onto. He didn't notice the way they flickered slightly in the corner near the ATM, or how the security camera above the entrance had a thin crack in its casing. Mark wasn't looking for details that morning. He was looking for relief. His daughter Sophie's field trip permission slip was due Monday. The electricity bill had a red stamp on it, and the sole of his right work boot had started separating from the leather 2 days ago, flapping slightly with each step, like a tired mouth trying to speak. These were the thoughts occupying Mark's mind as he stood in line, check folded in his jacket pocket, watching 3 people ahead of him conduct their business with the kind of leisure that only comes from financial security. Mark was 42 years old, but his hands looked 50. Years of night shifts, mopping floors, scrubbing toilets, and buffing corporate hallways had left them rough and cracked, the skin around his knuckles perpetually raw from industrial cleaning solutions. His Marine Corps days were more than a decade behind him now, buried under responsibilities that had nothing to do with honor or service and everything to do with survival. Sophie was 8 years old. She had her mother's eyes, bright hazel, like sunlight through amber, and that was both a blessing and a knife in Mark's chest every time he looked at her. Emma had died when Sophie was 3, a drunk driver on a Tuesday afternoon, and Mark had been carrying both their weights ever since. Some nights, after his daughter fell asleep, he'd sit at their tiny kitchen table and wonder if he was doing any of it right, if love was enough when the bills said otherwise. The line moved forward. An elderly woman in a purple cardigan completed her transaction, offering the teller a kind smile and a comment about the weather. The teller, a young man with carefully styled hair and a name tag that read Brandon, responded with practiced enthusiasm. Mark checked his watch. 9:47 a.m. He'd dropped Sophie at Riverside Elementary 40 minutes ago, watched her run toward the playground in those shoes that were getting too small, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. She'd turned at the gate and waved, and he'd waved back, and that moment felt like it always did, like she was walking away from him just a little bit more each day. A businessman in a gray suit stepped up to the counter. Mark shifted his weight, feeling that separated sole flap again. He'd glue it tonight, he decided. Hardware store had that strong adhesive in the clearance section. $3.50. He could manage that. Behind him, the glass doors opened. Mark didn't turn around. People came and went from banks all the time. Friday mornings were busy. He was focused on the businessman ahead of him, who seemed to be having some kind of issue with a wire transfer, the teller typing and clicking with increasing urgency. What Mark did notice, and would remember for the rest of his life, was the change in the air. That particular quality of tension that makes the back of your neck tighten. The sensation he'd learned to trust in Fallujah, in Helmand Province, in all those places where ignoring your instincts could mean a body bag. The quality of silence that isn't really silent at all, but rather the absence of normal sounds, the held breath before violence. He turned his head just slightly, peripheral vision catching movement by the entrance. 3 men, black masks, the kind you see in movies, the ski masks that turn human faces into blank, terrifying voids. And guns, not handguns, shotguns, the short-barreled kind that made a statement before they ever fired. "Everyone on the fucking ground, now!" The words came like an explosion, shattering that Friday morning peace into 1,000 pieces. The elderly woman in the purple cardigan screamed. Brandon the teller's hand shot up so fast his computer mouse flew off the desk. The businessman in gray dropped his briefcase and it hit the marble with a sound like breaking bones. Mark's body remembered before his mind could catch up. His knees bent, his center of gravity dropped, and he was moving. Not down to the ground like everyone else, but laterally, diving behind the thick marble column that supported the bank's vaulted ceiling. His shoulder hit the cold stone with a dull thud that would leave a bruise, but he barely felt it. His heart was jackhammering in his chest, his breathing suddenly shallow and controlled, every sense sharpening into that combat clarity he'd thought he left behind years ago. "Phone's out. Wallet's out. You fucking move, you die." The voice belonged to the tallest of the three robbers, the one who'd kicked the door open. He was waving his shotgun in wide arcs, the barrel tracking across terrified faces like a predator selecting prey. The other two fanned out immediately, their movements coordinated, practiced. This wasn't their first robbery. Mark could tell by the way they moved, the way they covered angles, the way one immediately vaulted the counter while the other grabbed the nearest customer, a woman in a navy blue suit who'd been standing by the deposit slips. She fell hard. Mark heard the impact of her knees hitting marble, heard her cry out in pain and terror. From his position behind the column, he could see her clearly now. Mid-40s, maybe? Dark hair pulled back in a professional bun that was already coming undone. Designer suit, expensive but understated. Leather briefcase lying 3 feet away where she'd dropped it. And the expression on her face, that raw animal fear that came from staring at your own mortality. The robber, shorter, stockier than the leader, grabbed her by the arm and yanked her up. "Open the vault," he snarled, his voice muffled behind the mask. "You look management. You got keys." I'm not," the woman started, her voice breaking. "I don't work here. I'm just a customer. Please, I'm just—" "Liar!" The robber shook her so hard her head snapped back. Then he shoved the shotgun against her temple. The metallic click of the safety disengaging was loud as a thunderclap in that acoustic space. "You got 3 seconds to stop lying, bitch. 1. Mark's mind went absolutely cold. Not frozen. Cold. Calculating. Processing. The combat veteran in him was running numbers, measuring distances, computing probabilities. 20 feet to the woman. 2 robbers between him and her. One at the counter, back turned. Leader by the door, eyes scanning, too far to intercede quickly. Stocky one with the gun to her head, finger on the trigger, nerve endings stretched thin as wire. No weapon, no body armor, no backup, just an old Marine with rough hands and a daughter who needed her father to come home. 2. The woman's eyes squeezed shut, tears streamed down her face. Her lips moved silently. Prayer, maybe, or goodbye. Mark could see her whole body shaking, could see the robber's finger tightening on that trigger, could see exactly how this was about to end. Sophie's face flashed through his mind. Her wave at the school gate this morning, her laughter when he made pancakes last Sunday, even though he burned them. The way she crawled into his bed during thunderstorms, still young enough to believe her father could protect her from anything. This wasn't his fight. This wasn't his responsibility. He had a daughter who needed him more than this stranger in a navy suit needed him. But Emma's voice was in his head now, clear as if she were standing beside him. The last thing she'd ever said to him, in that hospital bed with the machines beeping and her hand cold in his. "Promise me you'll teach her what matters. Not what's easy. What matters." 3. Mark moved. Later, when the police asked him to describe what happened, he couldn't really explain it. It wasn't thought. It wasn't decision. It was pure action. The body moving before the mind could interfere. All that training and all those years in combat collapsing into a single moment of absolute commitment. He exploded from behind the column like a linebacker leaving the line, his boots finding traction on that polished marble floor. The stocky robber's peripheral vision caught the movement a half-second too late. The man started to turn, started to redirect the shotgun, but Mark was already inside his arc, already driving forward with every ounce of force his 190-pound frame could generate. The tackle caught the robber at chest height. Mark's shoulder connected with the man's sternum with a sound like a baseball bat hitting meat. The air went out of the robber in a shocked wheeze. They crashed together into the customer service counter, Mark's momentum carrying them over in a tangle of limbs and fury. The shotgun went flying, skittering across the marble floor with a metallic scraping that seemed to last forever. Mark didn't stop moving. Couldn't stop. In combat, hesitation was death. He got his hand around the robber's throat, squeezing, his other hand pinning the man's gun arm. The robber thrashed beneath him, stronger than he looked, knee coming up and catching Mark in the ribs hard enough to crack something. Pain exploded in Mark's side, but his grip didn't loosen. "Run!" Mark shouted at the woman in the navy suit, his voice raw and desperate. "Go! Now!" She was frozen, still on her knees, eyes wide with shock. For a terrible second, Mark thought she wouldn't move, thought fear had rooted her to the spot. Then something clicked behind her eyes. Survival instinct, maybe, or just pure adrenaline. And she scrambled to her feet, stumbling, nearly falling again. That's when the world erupted. "Shoot her!" The leader by the door had finally processed what was happening. He swung his shotgun up, tracking toward Mark and his struggling adversary. The muzzle was a black hole, a void about to birth destruction. Mark had just enough time to register what was coming. Not enough time to stop it. Not enough time to save himself. The shotgun roared. Sound became physical force, slamming into Mark's eardrums. The ceiling exploded above them. The leader's shot had gone high, panicked, hitting the decorative light fixture instead of its intended target. Glass rained down in 1,000 glittering pieces, fluorescent tubes shattering and sending sparks cascading. Someone was screaming. Maybe multiple someones. The bank filled with smoke and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Mark used the chaos. He released the stocky robber's throat and rolled, grabbing the fallen shotgun with both hands. It was heavier than he expected, or maybe his arms were just shaking too hard. He didn't know how to fire it. He didn't want to fire it. He just needed it away from them, away from anyone. He hurled the weapon toward the far corner of the bank, sending it spinning through the air. It hit the wall with a crash and clattered to rest near a potted plant. The woman in the navy suit was running now, finally, heading for the emergency exit at the side of the building. Good. That was good. Mark felt a flash of relief even as the stocky robber beneath him landed a punch to his jaw that made his vision white out for a second. He tasted blood, his own blood. Copper and salt on his tongue. The leader fired again, this time more controlled. The shot punched through the air where the woman had been standing 2 seconds earlier, obliterating a customer chair and sending stuffing exploding into the air. But she was already at the exit, her hand on the push bar. "Go!" Mark screamed again, though he wasn't sure if any sound was coming out anymore. His ears were ringing, the world muffled and strange, like being underwater. The woman pushed through the exit. The alarm shrieked, a high-pitched wail that somehow cut through even Mark's damaged hearing. She was out. She was safe. Mark had kept his promise to Emma. What mattered? Not what was easy. Now he just had to survive the next 60 seconds. The stocky robber bucked hard, finally getting leverage, throwing Mark off. Mark's back hit the marble and knocked the wind out of him. He gasped, ribs screaming where he'd been kneed. The robber was up faster than Mark, reaching for something at his belt. Not another gun, a knife. Long and serrated, the kind that hunters used for field dressing. "You're fucking dead," the robber hissed, all pretense of control gone now, just rage and violence. Mark tried to scramble backwards, but his boot caught on something, his own separated soul flapping uselessly. He went down again, hard, elbow cracking against the floor. The robber was on him, knee pressing into Mark's chest, all that weight cutting off his air. The knife came up, blade catching the emergency lighting, ready to descend. This was it. This was how it ended. Not in Helmand Province. Not in any of the places where death had seemed appropriate. But in a suburban bank on a Friday morning, because Mark Ellison couldn't walk away from someone in trouble. Sophie's face. That wave at the school gate. Who would pick her up today? Who would make sure she knew she was loved? The knife started down. A shotgun blast tore through the air, but this time not from inside the bank. The leader by the door jerked backward, a red bloom appearing on his shoulder. He dropped his weapon, screaming. Through the shattered front windows, Mark could see movement. Police, at least 4 of them, taking positions behind their vehicles in the parking lot, weapons drawn. "Cops! Cops!" The third robber, the one who'd been at the counter, was suddenly abandoning his post, scrambling toward the back of the bank. The stocky one on top of Mark hesitated, knife still raised, his eyes darting between Mark and the exit. His partners were already running, the leader clutching his wounded shoulder, blood streaming between his fingers. Sirens. So many sirens, getting closer, the wail of them filling the morning air like the soundtrack to judgment. The stocky robber made his choice. He threw himself off Mark and ran, following his partners toward the back exit, leaving the knife behind. It hit the floor beside Mark's head with a dull clink. Then they were gone. The broken glass, the smoke, the screaming, it all continued. But the immediate threat was over. The robbery was done. Mark lay on the cold marble floor, staring up at the ceiling where fluorescent lights flickered through settling dust. His ribs hurt. His jaw hurt. His elbow hurt. Everything hurt. But he was alive. The woman was alive. He started laughing. It came out as a wet, painful sound, almost a sob. He couldn't stop. Combat high, probably. Adrenaline crash. Whatever therapists called it. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. Footsteps thundered into the bank. Police officers, tactical vests and raised weapons, shouting commands that Mark couldn't quite process. Someone was kneeling beside him, hands on his shoulders. A young officer, maybe 25, eyes wide with concern. "Sir? Sir, are you hit? Where are you hurt?" Mark tried to sit up, and the officer pressed him back down. "I'm okay." The woman in the blue suit. "She got out?" "Someone went through the emergency exit, yeah. We got her. She's safe." The officer was checking Mark over, looking for wounds, finding the bruises that were already forming. "EMTs are on their way. Just stay down, okay? You're in shock." Mark nodded, or thought he nodded. The world was getting fuzzy around the edges, sound fading in and out like a badly tuned radio. He could hear more voices now, more footsteps. Someone was crying. Brandon the teller, maybe, or the elderly woman in the purple cardigan. "The check," Mark mumbled. "I need to cash my check." The young officer gave him a strange look. "Sir, I don't think that's a priority right now." But it was. It was all Mark could think about as they loaded him onto a stretcher, as they carried him out into the parking lot where news vans were already arriving, cameras already rolling, the electricity bill, Sophie's field trip, those shoes that were getting too small. He'd saved someone. He'd done what mattered. And in doing so, he'd missed his chance to deposit his paycheck, which meant next week would be even harder than this one. The EMTs were saying something about his arm. Mark looked down and saw blood for the first time, a dark stain spreading through his jacket sleeve. He hadn't even felt it happen. Must have been during the tackle, or maybe when they were struggling. Just a graze, probably. Nothing serious. "Sophie," he said to no one in particular. "I have to pick up Sophie. 3:15. Can someone—" "We'll make sure someone calls," a female voice said. A paramedic, kind eyes, already wrapping his arm. "We'll get it sorted out. Just focus on staying calm." Calm. Right. Mark closed his eyes as they loaded him into the ambulance, as the sirens started up again, as the world became motion and noise in the aftermath of adrenaline. Calm was for people who didn't have daughters to raise and bills to pay and boots with flapping soles. But he'd kept his promise to Emma. That's what mattered, even if it cost him everything else. The ambulance pulled away from Crestline Bank, leaving behind shattered glass and bullet holes and a morning that would never be normal again. Mark didn't see the woman in the navy suit standing by a police cruiser, wrapped in a blanket despite the mild weather, watching the ambulance leave. Didn't see the way her hands were shaking or the way she asked the officer standing guard over her, "Who was he? The man who tackled them. What's his name?" Didn't see the officer check his notes and respond, "Ellison, Mark Ellison. Looks like he was just a customer. Wrong place, wrong time." Didn't see the way the woman's eyes narrowed slightly, committing that name to memory. Laura Kensington didn't forget debts, especially the kind that couldn't be repaid with money. But that would all come later. For now, Mark Ellison just lay in the ambulance, counting ceiling tiles and thinking about Sophie's wave at the school gate and wondering if being a hero was worth the cost of being broke. The answer would surprise him more than he could possibly imagine. The hospital waiting room smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee, a combination that made Mark's stomach turn even before the nausea from the adrenaline crash fully set in. He sat on a plastic chair that was bolted to the floor, his wrapped arm throbbing in time with his heartbeat, watching a wall-mounted television play silent news coverage of the very event he'd just lived through. The footage was surreal. Helicopter shots of Crestline Bank surrounded by police vehicles, their lights still flashing in broad daylight. A reporter standing behind yellow tape, mouth moving urgently while the closed captions scrolled below. 3 armed suspects fled the scene after an attempted robbery was interrupted by what witnesses are calling an act of extraordinary heroism by an unidentified customer. Unidentified. Mark preferred it that way. The last thing he needed was his face plastered across the evening news, people asking questions, attention he couldn't afford and didn't want. "Mr. Ellison?" A nurse appeared from behind a blue curtain, clipboard in hand. She was older, probably close to retirement, with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and the efficient demeanor of someone who'd seen everything twice. "Doctor wants to see you now. Follow me, please." Mark stood, his ribs protesting the movement. The nurse noticed his wince and slowed her pace, leading him through a maze of curtained examination bays where other patients waited in various states of distress. A child with a broken arm. An elderly man hooked up to monitors. The ambient sounds of suffering and healing blended into white noise. The examination bay she led him to was identical to all the others. Pale green curtains, a paper-covered table, a rolling stool, and medical equipment Mark couldn't name mounted on the walls. She gestured for him to sit on the table, and the paper crinkled loudly under his weight. "Dr. Martinez will be with you shortly," she said, making notes on her clipboard. "The bullet wound is superficial, but he'll want to make sure there's no nerve damage. You're very lucky." Lucky. The word felt strange in Mark's mouth. He'd been tackled, kneed in the ribs, punched in the jaw, and grazed by a bullet. But he was alive and relatively intact, so maybe lucky was the right word after all. The nurse left, and Mark was alone with the hum of fluorescent lights and his own thoughts. He checked his phone for the 14th time since arriving at the hospital. Still no missed calls, but he had 6 text messages, all from Diane Peterson, his supervisor at Morrison Janitorial Services. The first one read, "Mark, where are you? You were supposed to start your shift an hour ago." The subsequent messages grew progressively more irritated, culminating in, "This is strike 2. Don't bother coming in this weekend if you can't commit to your schedule." Mark's jaw tightened. He typed out a response explaining what had happened, then deleted it, then typed it again, then deleted it again. What was he supposed to say? "Sorry I'm late. I stopped a bank robbery?" It sounded ridiculous even in his own head, like the kind of excuse someone made up when they overslept. Before he could decide how to respond, the curtain pulled back and a man in a white coat entered. Dr. Martinez was younger than Mark expected, maybe late 30s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the careful hands of someone who took his work seriously. "Mr. Ellison, I'm Dr. Martinez. I've reviewed the paramedics' report and the preliminary examination. How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck," Mark admitted. "But I've had worse." Martinez pulled on latex gloves and approached the examination table. "Mind if I take a look at that arm? The paramedics did good work, but I want to make sure we don't need to do anything more extensive." Mark nodded and extended his injured arm. The doctor unwrapped the bandage carefully, revealing an angry red line about 3 inches long across Mark's upper arm. The bullet had carved a groove through the skin and muscle but hadn't penetrated deep. It looked worse than it felt, which Mark supposed was better than the alternative. "You're lucky," Martinez said, echoing the nurse. "Another inch to the left and we'd be looking at serious arterial damage. As it is, this is going to need thorough cleaning and some stitches, but there's no permanent damage. Can you make a fist for me?" Mark complied, his fingers curling and uncurling without difficulty. The doctor palpated the area around the wound, checking for nerve response, nodding to himself as he worked. "Good. Sensation is intact. Range of motion looks normal. I'm going to clean this out, give you a local anesthetic, and stitch you up. You'll want to keep it dry for at least a week, and I'm prescribing antibiotics to prevent infection. Do you have someone who can help you at home if you need it?" "My daughter," Mark said. "She's 8. Martinez paused in his preparation, a bottle of saline in one hand, gauze in the other. 8? That's young for caretaker duties. Do you have any other family nearby? Friends? Mark shook his head. His parents were dead. Emma's parents had moved to Arizona after she died, couldn't bear to be in the same city where they'd lost their daughter. And friends? That required time and energy Mark didn't have to spare. He had coworkers, acquaintances, people who knew his name and waved when they passed. But no one he could call at 2 in the morning. No one who'd drop everything to help. "We manage," Mark said simply. The doctor didn't push, which Mark appreciated. He just went about his work with quiet efficiency, cleaning the wound with methodical care. The saline solution was cold against Mark's skin, and he focused on that sensation rather than the deeper pain underneath. Martinez worked in silence for several minutes before speaking again. "The police want to talk to you when we're finished here. There's a detective waiting outside. You don't have to speak with them right away if you're not feeling up to it." "It's fine," Mark said. "I figured they'd have questions." "Still, you've been through a traumatic event. Take your time. Make sure you're ready." Martinez finished cleaning and reached for the syringe of local anesthetic. "You're going to feel a pinch. Try to stay still." The needle went in, sharp and cold, but Mark barely reacted. He'd had worse. Hell, he'd stitched his own hand once in Helmand when the field medic was dealing with more serious casualties. This was nothing. As the anesthetic took effect, numbing his arm into a distant, disconnected thing, Mark's phone buzzed again. Another text from Diane. "Last chance to respond before I put you down for termination." His chest tightened. He couldn't lose this job. Sophie's health insurance came through Morrison Janitorial. Her after-school program was paid for by the Employee Assistance Fund. Without this job, they'd be in serious trouble within a month. "Something wrong?" Martinez asked, threading the suture needle. "Work," Mark muttered. "My supervisor doesn't believe I had a good reason for missing my shift." "Tell her to call the hospital. We'll verify your treatment." The doctor made the first stitch, his hands steady and precise. "I'm assuming your employer will be understanding about the circumstances." Mark didn't respond. Understanding wasn't a word he associated with Diane Peterson. She was the kind of supervisor who saw employees as interchangeable units of labor, easily replaced if they didn't perform. Mark had watched her fire a guy for being 10 minutes late 3 times in 2 months. Never mind that the guy's car had broken down and public transit in their city was a nightmare. The stitching continued in silence. Mark counted each pull of the thread, each tug at his skin. 15 stitches total. Martinez worked with the concentration of an artist, making sure each stitch was placed perfectly. The tension even. When he finished, he dressed the wound with fresh bandages and stripped off his gloves. "All done. I'm writing you a prescription for antibiotics and pain medication. Take them as directed. The stitches should dissolve on their own in about 2 weeks, but I want you to come back in 1 week for a follow-up. Can you commit to that?" "I'll be here," Mark promised, though he had no idea how he'd afford the copay for a follow-up visit. His insurance through Morrison had a $1,000 deductible, and he'd already blown through most of it when Sophie had pneumonia last winter. Martinez handed him a paper with aftercare instructions and 2 prescription slips. "The pharmacy downstairs can fill these today. Any questions?" "How long until I can work?" "Physical labor?" Martinez considered. "I'd say rest for at least 3 days. After that, light duty only for another week. Nothing that involves heavy lifting or repetitive arm movements. You need to give those muscles time to heal properly." 3 days. Mark's mind raced through the math. 3 days without pay meant roughly $360 he wouldn't have. That was groceries. That was the electric bill. That was the difference between making it and not making it. "Right," Mark said, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Thanks, Doc." Martinez seemed to sense the distress under Mark's calm exterior. He pulled up the rolling stool and sat down, bringing himself to eye level with Mark. "Look, I can tell you're worried about money. Most people in your situation would be. The hospital has a financial assistance program. The social worker can set you up with an application before you leave. It might help with his bills from today." "I'll manage," Mark said automatically, the way he always did. Pride was expensive, but it was all he had left sometimes. "Stubborn is one thing, stupid is another." Martinez's tone was gentle but firm. "I'm going to have someone from social services stop by before you leave. Just talk to them. That's all I'm asking." Before Mark could protest, the doctor stood and pulled back the curtain. A detective was indeed waiting outside, exactly as Martinez had warned. She was tall, black, maybe early 50s, with sharp eyes that had seen too much and a wedding ring that caught the fluorescent light as she tucked her notebook under her arm. "Mr. Ellison, I'm Detective Patricia Warren. Mind if I ask you a few questions about what happened at Crestline Bank?" Mark nodded, and she stepped into the examination bay as Martinez departed. Warren pulled the curtain closed behind her, creating a small pocket of privacy in the busy emergency room. She didn't sit, just stood with her weight balanced on both feet, ready to move if necessary. A cop's stance. "First off," Warren said, "that was either the bravest or the stupidest thing I've seen in 20 years of police work. Possibly both." "Probably both," Mark agreed. A smile flickered across Warren's face, brief as lightning. "Fair enough. Walk me through what happened, start to finish. Take your time." So Mark did. He described the morning, dropping Sophie at school, entering the bank to cash his check. The three masked men with shotguns, the woman in the navy suit being grabbed and threatened. His decision to intervene, the tackle, the gunfire, helping the woman escape. He kept his voice steady and factual, the way he'd learned to give after-action reports in the Marines. Just the facts, no emotion, no editorial. Warren took notes the entire time, her pen scratching across the page in rapid shorthand. Occasionally, she'd interrupt with a clarifying question. "You said the stocky one had a knife. What kind of knife? Fixed blade or folding? The leader's gun before he fired, did you notice if it was pump action or semi-automatic?" Questions that told Mark she knew her business. When he finished, Warren flipped her notebook closed and studied him for a long moment. "You've got military training. I can tell by the way you describe the scene." "Marine Corps?" "Yes, ma'am. Served 8 years. Infantry." "Thought so. That training saved your life today, you know that? Normal civilian tries what you did, they end up dead. You read the situation, acted within your capabilities, and got lucky." She paused. "The woman you saved, she's been asking about you. Wants to thank you personally." Mark's chest tightened with something like embarrassment. "That's not necessary. I'm just glad she's okay." "She's more than okay. She's insistent." Warren pulled a business card from her jacket pocket. "This is my contact information. We may need you to come in and give a formal statement in the next few days. And for what it's worth, Mr. Ellison, the department appreciates what you did. You saved lives today. That matters." She left before Mark could respond, the curtain swaying in her wake. He stared at the business card, Detective Patricia Warren, Robbery Homicide Division, then tucked it into his pocket next to the prescription slips. A few minutes later, a young woman in business casual attire appeared. She introduced herself as Kelly from Social Services and launched into an explanation of financial assistance programs with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested she genuinely cared about helping people. Mark listened politely, accepted the paperwork she offered, and promised he'd look it over. He probably wouldn't. Charity stuck in his throat like a fishbone. By the time he was finally discharged, it was past 2 in the afternoon. Sophie's school let out at 3:15, which meant Mark had a little over an hour to get across town, pick up his daughter, and figure out what the hell to tell her about why his arm was bandaged and why he looked like he'd been in a fight. The pharmacy visit ate up 20 minutes and another $40 he didn't have. The pain medication prescription alone cost $32, even with insurance. Mark stood at the counter, staring at the total on the card reader, doing mental math about which bills he could delay. The internet could wait a week. Sophie wouldn't miss it that much. He paid with his debit card and tried not to think about the overdraft fees that might be coming. Outside the hospital, the afternoon sun felt too bright after hours under fluorescent lights. Mark's phone buzzed again. Not Diane this time, but an unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him hit the green button. "Hello? Mr. Ellison?" The voice was female, professional, and completely unfamiliar. "This is Sarah Chen from Crestline Bank. I'm calling to apologize for what happened this morning and to let you know that the check you were attempting to cash has been processed and deposited directly into your account as a courtesy. The funds should be available immediately." Mark stopped walking. "What?" "Your check, sir. We processed it. Given the circumstances, it seemed like the least we could do." Sarah Chen sounded genuinely apologetic, as if the bank robbery had been a personal failing on her part. Additionally, Crestline Bank would like to cover any medical expenses you incurred as a result of your heroic actions. If you could send your hospital bills to my email, we'll take care of them. That's not necessary, Mark said automatically. Mr. Ellison, you were injured stopping a robbery in our bank. It's absolutely necessary. Please, let us do this. She gave him her email address, which Mark fumbled to type into his phone notes with one hand. And Mr. Ellison, thank you. What you did today was extraordinary. The call ended, and Mark stood on the sidewalk outside the hospital, phone still pressed to his ear, trying to process what had just happened. The check was deposited. The medical bills would be covered. Two massive problems solved in a single phone call. It felt wrong somehow, like accepting payment for doing the right thing cheapened it. But Sophie needed shoes, the electric bill needed paying, and Mark's pride, expensive as it was, couldn't feed his daughter. Okay, he said to no one. Okay. The bus ride to Sophie's school took 40 minutes and included 2 transfers. Mark spent the time rehearsing what he'd tell his daughter. The truth seemed both necessary and impossible. She was 8 years old. She still believed the world was fundamentally safe, that bad things happened to other people in other places. How did you explain that her father had nearly died that morning? That violence wasn't something that happened in movies but in ordinary places on ordinary days? He was still working on it when the bus dropped him off 2 blocks from Riverside Elementary. The school was a squat brick building built in the 1970s, outdated but solid, surrounded by a chain-link fence that desperately needed replacing. Kids poured out of the main entrance in waves, backpacks bouncing, voices raised in the particular chaos that only elementary school dismissal could create. Mark spotted Sophie before she spotted him. She was standing with a group of other kids near the playground, animated about something, her hands gesturing wildly as she talked. The 2 small shoes, the backpack he'd bought at a thrift store, the jacket with the frayed cuffs. She looked so small, so vulnerable. The world was full of men with masks and guns, and Mark was supposed to keep her safe from all of it on a janitor's salary. Then she saw him, and her whole face lit up. "Daddy!" She ran to him the way kids do, full speed and no hesitation, and Mark braced himself because he knew what was coming. She crashed into his legs, wrapping her arms around his waist, and the impact sent pain shooting through his bruised ribs. He couldn't help the sharp intake of breath, the slight flinch. Sophie pulled back immediately, her hazel eyes wide with concern. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just had a long day." Mark forced a smile and took her backpack, slinging it over his good shoulder. "How was school?" "Good. We learned about fractions and math. And at recess, Emily and I found a ladybug. And Mrs. Morrison said my story about the dragon was really creative." The words tumbled out in an unstoppable stream, the way they always did. Sophie saved up her entire day to share with him, and Mark never interrupted, no matter how tired he was. They started walking toward the bus stop, Sophie chattering beside him, and Mark thought maybe he could avoid the conversation altogether. Maybe she wouldn't notice the bandage on his arm until tomorrow, and by then he'd have figured out what to say. Then Sophie grabbed his hand across the street, and her fingers brushed against the edge of his bandage under his jacket sleeve. "Daddy, what happened to your arm?" Mark took a breath, then another. They reached the bus stop, and he sat down on the bench, pulling Sophie down next to him. A few other parents and kids waited nearby, but no one was paying attention to them. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully, okay?" Sophie's expression went serious, the way it did when she knew something important was coming. "Okay. This morning, after I dropped you off at school, I went to the bank, and while I was there, some bad men came in. They had guns, and they were scaring people." Sophie's eyes widened, but she didn't interrupt. "There was a lady there, and she was in trouble. The bad men were hurting her, so I helped her get away." Mark kept his voice steady, age-appropriate, stripping out the violence and terror as much as he could. "I got hurt a little bit, just on my arm, but I'm okay. The doctors fixed me up, and I'm going to be fine." "Did the bad men get away?" Sophie whispered. "The police chased them off. Everyone is safe now." Sophie was quiet for a long moment, processing. Then she reached out and very gently touched his bandaged arm, her small fingers barely making contact. Does it hurt? A little, but I've had worse. Were you scared? The question caught Mark off guard. He started to give her the easy answer, the one that would make him seem brave and invincible. But Emma's voice was in his head again. What matters, not what's easy. Yeah, Mark admitted. I was really scared. But sometimes we have to do things even when we're scared. That's what being brave actually means. Sophie leaned against his side, careful to avoid his injured arm. I'm glad you helped the lady. Mom would be proud of you. Mark's throat tightened. He wrapped his good arm around his daughter and held her close, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo and school cafeteria lunch. Thanks, kiddo. The bus arrived, and they climbed aboard, finding seats near the back. Sophie pulled out a library book and started reading, occasionally pointing out pictures to Mark and providing commentary. The normalcy of it was surreal after the morning's chaos. The world had almost ended, and now they were just riding the bus home like any other day. Mark's phone buzzed again. Another text from Diane. Your termination paperwork will be ready Monday. You can pick up your final check then. He stared at the message for a long moment, then put his phone away. He'd deal with it later. Right now, Sophie was showing him a picture of a wizard in her book, and that was more important than anything else. They got off the bus 6 blocks from their apartment, a third-floor walk-up in a building that had seen better decades. The elevator had been broken for 2 months, so they took the stairs, Sophie bounding up ahead of him while Mark climbed more slowly, his ribs protesting with each step. Their apartment was small, just 2 bedrooms, a cramped kitchen, and a living room that barely fit their second-hand couch and TV. But it was clean. Mark made sure of that. He might not have been able to give Sophie much, but he could give her clean. Homework first, then you can watch TV, Mark said, the same thing he said every afternoon. Sophie groaned but complied, dumping her backpack on the kitchen table and pulling out her math worksheet. Mark made her a snack, peanut butter on crackers because they were out of jelly, and then collapsed onto the couch. His entire body ached. The pain medication was starting to wear off, and he considered taking another pill but decided against it. He needed to stay sharp, needed to figure out his next move. No job, medical bills that might or might not be covered, a daughter who needed stability and security that Mark wasn't sure he could provide anymore. He must have dozed off because the next thing he knew, Sophie was shaking his good shoulder. Daddy, it's dinner time. Mark blinked awake, disoriented. The apartment was darker, late afternoon sun slanting through the windows. He checked his phone. 6:30. He'd been asleep for almost 3 hours. Sorry, sweetheart. I'll make something. I already made sandwiches, Sophie announced proudly, gesturing to the kitchen table where 2 plates waited, each with a somewhat lopsided peanut butter and jelly sandwich. She'd found the jelly after all. Mark's chest squeezed with love and grief in equal measure. 8 years old and already learning to take care of herself because her father couldn't be relied on. These look perfect, he said, and meant it. They ate together at the table, Sophie telling him more about her day, about Emily and the ladybug, about the kickball game at recess where she'd actually hit the ball for once. Mark listened and nodded and tried to be present, but part of his mind was already racing ahead to next week, next month. How he'd find a new job, how he'd explain the gap in employment, how he'd keep them afloat while he looked. After dinner, Sophie had her bath and changed into pajamas, then climbed onto the couch next to Mark for their nightly routine. They were working through Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, a chapter a night. Sophie loved it. Mark's voice was rough from exhaustion, but he read anyway, watching his daughter's eyes get heavy, her breathing slow. Daddy, she murmured, nearly asleep. You're a hero, like Harry Potter. I'm not a hero, kiddo. I'm just your dad. Same thing, she whispered, and then she was out, her small body warm against his side. Mark sat there for a long time after Sophie fell asleep, the book still open in his lap, staring at nothing. The apartment was quiet except for the distant sounds of traffic and neighbors. Through the thin walls, he could hear the couple next door arguing about money, their voices rising and falling in a familiar rhythm. His phone buzzed one more time, another unknown number. Mark almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Mr. Ellison? It was a man's voice this time, older, authoritative. This is Richard Hayes, VP of Security for Crestline Holdings. I apologize for calling so late, but I wanted to personally thank you for your actions this morning. What you did was remarkable. Just did what anyone would do, Mark said quietly, not wanting to wake Sophie. That's demonstrably false, Mr. Ellison. Most people freeze. Most people think of themselves first. You didn't. Hayes paused. I'd like to meet with you this week if possible. I have a proposal that might interest you. What kind of proposal? The kind we should discuss in person. Are you available Monday morning, say 10 o'clock? Mark thought about his schedule, then remembered he didn't have a schedule anymore. Diane had fired him. Monday morning was wide open. I can do that. Excellent. I'll have my assistant send you the address. And Mr. Ellison, get some rest. You've earned it. The call ended, and Mark sat in the darkness, holding his sleeping daughter, wondering what the hell Monday would bring. A job offer, maybe? Security work paid better than janitorial. He could hope. Outside, the city continued its evening symphony. Sirens and horns and the low rumble of the subway. Somewhere out there, 3 men with masks and guns were running, trying to disappear. Somewhere out there, a woman in a navy suit was probably lying in her own bed, thinking about how close she'd come to dying. And here, in the small apartment with peeling paint and a broken elevator, Mark Ellison held his daughter and tried to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. Sophie stirred, mumbling something about dragons, and Mark carefully lifted her, carrying her to her bedroom. She didn't wake as he tucked her in, didn't wake as he kissed her forehead. 8 years old, still so young, still believing her father could protect her from anything. Mark stood in the doorway of her room for a long moment, watching her sleep, and made himself a promise. Whatever happened Monday, whatever Richard Hayes wanted to discuss, whatever came next, he would find a way. For Sophie. Always for Sophie. He closed her door softly and returned to the living room, finally allowing himself to take that second pain pill. His arm throbbed. His ribs ached. His jaw was swollen where the robber had punched him. But he was alive, and Sophie was safe, and tomorrow the sun would rise on a world where Mark Ellison had done something that mattered. That would have to be enough. The weekend passed in a strange fog of normalcy and surrealism. Saturday morning, Mark woke to find Sophie already dressed and eating cereal at the kitchen table, cartoons playing quietly on the TV. His arm throbbed dully under the bandage, a constant reminder that Friday hadn't been a dream. He took his antibiotic with lukewarm coffee and watched his daughter laugh at something on the screen, her face lit by morning sunlight streaming through their apartment window. She didn't ask about the bank again, seemed content to accept that her father had helped someone and gotten hurt, and that was that. Kids had a remarkable ability to compartmentalize trauma, to file it away and return to the comfortable rhythms of their small lives. Mark envied that ability. His own mind kept returning to that moment when the stocky robber's knife had been raised above him, kept replaying the sound of gunfire, the smell of cordite, the weight of his choice. Saturday afternoon, they went to the park because it was free and Sophie needed to burn energy. Mark sat on a bench while she played on the swings, his injured arm resting in his lap. Other parents were scattered around the playground, some watching their children with the vigilant attention of new parents, others scrolling through phones with the weary confidence of veterans who knew their kids' limits. Mark wondered if any of them had nearly died yesterday. Probably not. Probably that was a distinctly Mark Ellison kind of Friday. His phone buzzed with an email from Richard Hayes' assistant, a woman named Patricia, who wrote in the clipped, efficient tone of someone who managed important people's time for a living. The meeting Monday was confirmed for 10 at the Crestline Holdings building downtown, 43rd floor. Business casual attire suggested. Mark read the email 3 times, trying to decode what it meant. Business casual. He owned exactly 1 pair of khakis without stains and 1 button-down shirt that still fit. That would have to do. Sunday morning, Mark took Sophie to church. They weren't regular attendees, but Emma had been Catholic and had made Mark promise that Sophie would grow up with faith, even if Mark's own relationship with God was complicated at best. So twice a month they sat in the back pew of St. Catherine's, and Mark let the familiar liturgy wash over him while Sophie fidgeted and colored in the children's bulletin. Father Michael gave a homily about the Good Samaritan, about stopping to help when others passed by, and Mark felt the weight of coincidence settle on his shoulders. After Mass, Father Michael caught Mark at the door, gripping his good hand with both of his own. "I saw the news," the priest said quietly. His Irish accent was still thick despite 40 years in America. "What you did took tremendous courage." "Just reacted," Mark said, uncomfortable with the praise. "Didn't really think about it." That's often when we're most true to ourselves, when there's no time for fear or calculation. Father Michael's eyes were kind behind wire-rimmed glasses. "How's the arm?" "Healing?" "And the soul?" Mark didn't have an answer for that. Father Michael patted his shoulder and moved on to greet other parishioners, leaving Mark to collect Sophie and head home. Sunday afternoon dragged. Mark tried to read, tried to watch TV, tried to do anything but think about Monday's meeting. Sophie sensed his restlessness and suggested they bake cookies, something they only did on special occasions because ingredients cost money. But Mark needed the distraction, so they mixed and rolled and baked, filling the apartment with the smell of chocolate chips and butter. Sophie ate 3 cookies still warm from the oven, got chocolate on her face, and laughed when Mark tried to wipe it off with a dish towel. These were the moments Mark lived for. The simple, ordinary moments that added up to a childhood. He couldn't give Sophie much, but he could give her this. The memory of baking cookies with her father on a Sunday afternoon, the apartment warm and sweet-smelling, the world outside temporarily forgotten. Sunday night, after Sophie was asleep, Mark stood in front of his closet and pulled out the khakis and button-down shirt. The shirt was wrinkled. He didn't own an iron, so he hung it in the bathroom and ran the shower hot, hoping the steam would smooth out the worst of the creases. It was a trick he'd learned in the Marines when you needed to look presentable and had no resources. The steam helped, but the shirt still looked tired, like Mark himself. He tried it on, checking his reflection in the bathroom mirror. The bandage on his arm bulged under the sleeve, visible if you knew to look. His jaw was still slightly swollen, a purple-yellow bruise spreading from his chin to his ear. He looked like what he was, a man who'd been in a fight and barely won. Not exactly the image of a professional security expert. Mark took off the shirt and hung it carefully on the door, then returned to the living room. Sleep wouldn't come easy tonight, he knew. His mind was already racing ahead to tomorrow, to the 43rd floor of a building he'd only seen from the outside, to a meeting with people who existed in a different world than his own. He thought about the woman in the navy suit, Laura Kensington, the CEO. He'd Googled her name Saturday night after Sophie went to bed, found the official corporate biography on Crestline Holdings' website. Laura Kensington, appointed CEO 6 months ago, previously served as Chief Operating Officer, Harvard MBA, 20 years in financial services. The photo showed a woman in her mid-40s with intelligent eyes and the kind of confident smile that came from never having to worry about money. She'd been at the bank because of him. That's what he kept coming back to. If Mark hadn't been there, if he hadn't acted, she might be dead. A woman who ran a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars, who employed thousands of people, who had her own Wikipedia page. And Mark Ellison, night janitor with a GED and an honorable discharge, had saved her life. The weight of that was strange. Not heavy, exactly. Just strange. Monday morning arrived with gray skies and the threat of rain. Mark woke before his alarm, adrenaline already coursing through his system. He made Sophie breakfast, packed her lunch, walked her to school. At the gate, she turned and hugged him carefully, mindful of his injured arm. "Good luck at your meeting, Daddy." "Thanks, sweetheart. Mrs. Patterson will pick you up today, okay? I'll be home by dinner." Mrs. Patterson was their downstairs neighbor, a retired teacher who occasionally watched Sophie when Mark's schedule was chaotic. She'd agreed to help when Mark called Sunday evening, asked no questions when he mentioned a job interview, just said she'd be happy to spend the afternoon with Sophie. Mark watched his daughter disappear into the school building, then checked his phone. 8:15. The meeting was at 10. The Crestline Holdings building was downtown, about 40 minutes by bus and subway. He should leave now, give himself buffer time for delays. The commute was uneventful. Mark stood in the crowded subway car, holding the overhead rail with his good hand, swaying with the motion of the train. Around him, other people headed to their jobs, to their lives. A woman in a sharp suit scrolled through her phone. A young man with headphones bobbed his head to music only he could hear. An older couple sat together, the woman's head resting on the man's shoulder. All of them living their normal Monday mornings while Mark headed toward something that might change everything. The Crestline Holdings building was glass and steel, one of those modern structures that seemed to scrape the sky. Mark had walked past it 100 times when he worked downtown, had cleaned offices and buildings just like it. But he'd never been inside this particular one. The lobby was all marble and chrome, with a security desk manned by 2 guards in crisp uniforms and a wall of elevators that looked like they belonged in a spaceship. Mark approached the security desk, suddenly aware of how out of place he looked. His khakis and wrinkled shirt, his work boots because he didn't own dress shoes, his bandaged arm. The guards looked at him with the polite suspicion of people paid to keep undesirables out. "Can I help you?" The older guard's voice was neutral, professional. "I have a meeting with Richard Hayes, 10 o'clock. Mark Ellison." The guard checked his computer, typing with 2 fingers, then nodded. "ID, please." Mark handed over his driver's license, watched the guard scan it, and make a note in his system. The man printed out a visitor badge on a lanyard and slid it across the counter. 43rd floor, elevators to your right. You'll need this badge to access that floor." He handed Mark's ID back. "Have a good meeting, Mr. Ellison." The elevator ride took less than a minute, but felt longer. Mark watched the numbers climb on the digital display, felt his stomach drop slightly with the acceleration. The elevator was empty except for him, all mirrors and soft lighting. He caught his reflection and immediately looked away. The 43rd floor opened onto a reception area that probably cost more than Mark's entire apartment building. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, and the furniture looked like it belonged in a museum. A young woman sat at a sleek desk, blonde hair pulled back in a perfect bun, wearing a dress that probably cost more than Mark made in a month. "Mr. Ellison?" She smiled, warm but professional. "I'm Patricia. Mr. Hayes is expecting you. Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water?" "I'm fine, thank you." "Please, have a seat. He'll be with you in just a moment." Mark sat in one of the chairs that was too expensive to be comfortable and tried not to touch anything. The reception area was quiet except for the subtle hum of climate control and the distant sound of phones ringing. Through the windows, the city sprawled below, tiny cars and smaller people going about their lives. He didn't have to wait long. A door opened and a man emerged, tall and broad-shouldered, probably early 60s, with silver hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent time in the military. Richard Hayes extended his hand, and Mark stood to shake it. "Mr. Ellison, thank you for coming. Please follow me." "Follow." Hayes led him down a hallway lined with offices, each one offering glimpses of the corporate world Mark had only ever seen from the outside. They passed a conference room where a meeting was in progress, past cubicles where people typed and talked on headsets, past it all until they reached a corner office with Hayes' name on the door. The office was large but not ostentatious. A desk, comfortable chairs, bookshelves filled with security manuals and industry publications. More windows, always the windows. Hayes gestured for Mark to sit and closed the door, muffling the ambient office noise. "How's the arm?" Hayes settled into his chair, his movements economical and precise. "Healing. Doctor says I was lucky. Lucky and skilled. I reviewed the security footage from the bank. What you did wasn't luck, Mr. Ellison. That was training and instinct." Hayes leaned forward, elbows on his desk. "Marine Corps?" "Yes, sir. 8 years. Infantry. Combat deployments?" "3. Iraq and Afghanistan." Hayes nodded, something like recognition in his eyes. "Army myself. First Gulf War, then another tour in '03. Different wars, same mud." He picked up a folder from his desk, opened it, scanned the contents. "I did some research on you this weekend. Honorable discharge, commendations for valor, worked private security briefly after leaving the service, then a series of jobs in maintenance and janitorial services. You're overqualified for the work you've been doing." Mark didn't respond. What could he say? That the private security work had dried up when the economy crashed? That he'd taken what he could get to keep food on the table? That being overqualified didn't matter when you had a daughter to raise alone? "I'm not judging," Hayes continued. "I'm just observing. You're a man who does what needs to be done, regardless of ego. That's rare. He closed the folder and set it aside. I'm going to be direct with you, Mr. Ellison. Crestline Holdings is expanding our security division. We're looking for someone to head up our corporate security team, someone with real-world experience, someone who can think on their feet, someone who understands that security isn't just about protocols and procedures, but about protecting people. Mark's heart was hammering in his chest. You're offering me a job? I'm offering you an opportunity. The position would include overseeing security for all Crestline properties, managing a team of 12 security professionals, implementing safety protocols, and serving as primary liaison with law enforcement when necessary. The salary is $85,000 annually, full benefits including health insurance, dental, vision, and a retirement plan. Regular hours, Monday through Friday, with occasional evening or weekend work as needed. $85,000. Mark's current salary was $22,000. The numbers were so different they didn't seem to occupy the same reality. With that kind of money, Sophie could have new shoes whenever she needed them. They could afford a better apartment, maybe even save for her college education. The electricity bill would never have a red stamp again. Mr. Hayes, I appreciate this, but I have to be honest. I don't have any management experience. I've never run a team. I'm not sure I'm qualified for what you're describing. Let me tell you what qualifies you. Hayes's voice was firm but not unkind. Friday morning, when 3 armed men entered that bank, everyone else froze. Trained security guards, bank employees, customers, everyone except you. You assessed the situation, identified the primary threat, neutralized it, and protected civilians. That's not something you can teach in a classroom. That's instinct. That's character. I just did what anyone would do. No, you did what almost no one would do, and that's exactly why you're qualified. Hayes pulled a document from a drawer and slid it across the desk. This is the job offer. Take it home, read it, think about it. I don't need an answer today. But Mr. Ellison, I want you to seriously consider this opportunity. You have skills that are being wasted mopping floors. Mark picked up the document, his hands shaking slightly. The letterhead was heavy, expensive paper. His name was already typed in, Mark Ellison, Director of Corporate Security. It looked official. It looked real. There's one more thing, Hayes said. Ms. Kensington would like to speak with you. She's the one who actually suggested we bring you in. This was her idea. She's here? Just down the hall. If you're comfortable with it, I can take you to her office now. Mark nodded, not trusting his voice. Hayes stood and led him back into the hallway, past more offices and conference rooms, until they reached a set of double doors at the very end. Hayes knocked once, then opened the door. Miss Kensington, Mr. Ellison is here. The office beyond was twice the size of Hayes's, with a view that seemed to encompass the entire city. And there, standing by the windows with her back to the door, was the woman from the bank. She turned as they entered, and Mark recognized her immediately. The navy suit was gone, replaced by a charcoal dress and a jacket, but the face was the same, the woman whose life he'd saved. Mr. Ellison? Laura Kensington crossed the room in 3 strides and extended her hand. Her grip was firm, confident. Thank you for coming. That will be all, Richard. Close the door, please. Hayes left, and suddenly Mark was alone with the CEO of Crestline Holdings in an office that probably had its own zip code. Laura gestured to a sitting area near the windows, 2 chairs and a couch arranged around a coffee table. She didn't sit behind her desk, didn't put that barrier between them. Instead, she took one of the chairs and waited for Mark to sit across from her. I've been trying to figure out how to say thank you, she began. Nothing seems adequate. You saved my life, Mr. Ellison, at great personal risk to yourself. There's no way to properly thank someone for that. You don't need to thank me. I'm just glad you're okay. But I do need to thank you. And more than that, I need to do something, which is why I asked Richard to bring you in. She leaned forward slightly, her expression intense. I watched the security footage. I watched you tackle that man, watched you shield me, watched you take a bullet so I could get to safety. Do you understand what that means to me? Mark didn't know how to respond. He'd spent the last 3 days trying not to think too hard about what had happened, trying to fold it away and move forward. But Laura Kensington didn't seem interested in letting him do that. I have a daughter, she continued. She's 12. And Friday morning, I was thinking about her when that gun was pressed to my head. Thinking that I wouldn't see her grow up, wouldn't be there for her first heartbreak or her graduation or her wedding. And then you appeared. You gave me my life back. You gave my daughter her mother back. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and Mark saw tears in her eyes that she was fighting to control. This wasn't the polished CEO from the website photo. This was a woman who'd come within seconds of dying, who was still processing that reality. I did what anyone would do, Mark said again, because he didn't know what else to say. No, you didn't. Laura's voice was firm now, the emotion locked down. I've asked around about you, called some contacts, did some research. You're a single father. Your wife died 5 years ago. You're raising your daughter alone on a janitor's salary. You were at that bank to cash your paycheck so you could pay your bills. And you risked everything. Your life, your daughter's only parent. Everything. Mark's chest tightened. He didn't like being investigated, didn't like his life laid out like evidence. But he couldn't argue with the facts. Mr. Ellison, I'm not a particularly emotional person. I didn't get to this position by being sentimental, but I believe in paying debts. And I owe you a debt I can never fully repay, so I'm going to try. She picked up a folder from the coffee table and handed it to him. Richard showed you the job offer. That's real. I want you on my team, but there's more. Mark opened the folder. Inside was the employment contract Hayes had shown him, but there were additional pages, a signing bonus, $20,000. Health insurance that covered not just Mark, but Sophie too, with no deductible. A clause about tuition assistance for dependents, numbers and benefits that made Mark's head spin. This is too much, he managed. It's not enough. It will never be enough. Laura stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. I was supposed to be in Chicago Friday. There was a merger meeting I'd been planning for months, but Thursday night my daughter had a school concert. She was nervous. She wanted me there. So I rescheduled the Chicago meeting and stayed here. Friday morning, I decided to stop at the bank on my way to the office, a completely random decision. If I'd gone straight to work, I wouldn't have been there. She turned back to face Mark. My point is, life is random, chaos and chance. We don't control as much as we think we do. But sometimes, in the middle of all that chaos, we get a choice. And you chose to help a stranger when you had every reason not to. That means something. Mark stood, the folder still in his hands. Ms. Kensington, I appreciate this, more than you know. But I need to think about it. This is a big change. Of course. Take all the time you need, but I hope you'll say yes. You deserve better than what you have. Your daughter deserves better. Laura extended her hand again. Whatever you decide, thank you. For my life, for my daughter's mother, for everything. They shook hands, and Mark left, following the hallway back to the elevators, the folder tucked under his good arm. Patricia smiled at him as he passed the reception desk, and Mark managed to smile back. The elevator ride down was faster than the ride up, or maybe time was just distorted. By the time he reached the lobby and stepped out into the gray morning, he felt like he'd been inside for hours instead of less than one. The rain had started, a light drizzle that made the city look softer, less sharp. Mark stood under the awning of the Crestline building and stared at the folder in his hands. $85,000. Health insurance. A real job with real respect. The chance to be more than just Sophie's struggling father. His phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Patterson. Sophie's having a great time. We made brownies. Take all the time you need. Mark smiled despite himself. Sophie was fine. Sophie was always fine. She was resilient in a way that Mark envied and feared in equal measure. Resilient because she'd had to be. He walked to the subway station, descended into the familiar underground smell of metal and humanity, swiped his Metro card, and stood on the platform waiting for the train. Around him, other people waited too, all of them going somewhere. All of them carrying their own folders full of possibilities or failures or the ordinary weight of another Monday. The train arrived and Mark boarded, finding a seat near the door. He opened the folder again and read through the contract carefully. The legal language was dense, but the core was clear. Crestline Holdings was offering him a new life. All he had to do was say yes. But Mark had learned a long time ago that nothing was ever that simple. Good things came with strings attached. Opportunities came with expectations. And he'd been let down too many times to trust that this was real without examining it from every angle. He thought about Emma. What would she say? She'd been the optimist in their relationship, the one who believed in silver linings and happy endings. Mark had been the realist, the one who planned for disasters and prepared for the worst. They'd balanced each other. Without her, Mark tilted too far toward caution, toward protecting what little they had rather than reaching for more. But Emma was gone, and Sophie needed more than caution. She needed possibility. By the time Mark reached his stop, he'd made his decision. He climbed the stairs back to street level, the rain falling harder now, soaking through his thin jacket. He didn't care. He pulled out his phone and dialed the number on Patricia's email. She answered on the second ring. Crestline Holdings, Patricia speaking. This is Mark Ellison. I was just there meeting with Mr. Hayes and Miss Kensington. Yes, Mr. Ellison. How can I help you? Tell them I accept. The job. I accept. There was a brief pause, then Patricia's voice came back warm with genuine pleasure. That's wonderful, Mr. Ellison. I'll let them know immediately. Someone from HR will be in touch about start dates and onboarding. Congratulations. Thank you. Mark ended the call and stood in the rain, water running down his face, mixing with something that might have been tears but probably wasn't. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. In 3 days, his entire life had changed. Friday morning, he'd been a janitor barely scraping by. Monday afternoon, he was the director of corporate security for a major corporation. It didn't feel real. It felt like something that happened to other people in movies or books. Not to Mark Ellison, not to the guy with the flapping boot sole and the overdue electric bill. But it was real. The folder in his hands was real. The job offer was real. The chance to give Sophie something better was real. Mark started walking toward Mrs. Patterson's apartment, his pace quickening. He needed to pick up Sophie, needed to tell her that everything was going to be okay. Better than okay. They were going to be okay. The rain kept falling, but Mark barely noticed. He was thinking about new shoes for Sophie, a better apartment with a working elevator, health insurance that would cover her next bout of pneumonia without bankrupting them. All the small, ordinary securities that other people took for granted and that Mark had spent 5 years chasing. Mrs. Patterson answered the door with flour on her hands and a smile on her face. Mark, you're soaked. Come in, come in. I can't, I'm dripping. Is Sophie ready? Sophie, your dad's here, Mrs. Patterson called over her shoulder, then lowered her voice. How did it go? I got the job. Oh, Mark, that's wonderful. Sophie appeared in the hallway, her face lighting up when she saw him. Daddy, you're all wet. I know, kiddo. Let's get home, okay? Mark took her hand, thanked Mrs. Patterson, and they headed up the stairs to their apartment. Inside, Mark dried off with a towel while Sophie chattered about the brownies they'd made and a game they'd played. He let her talk, just enjoying the sound of her voice, the normalcy of her day. When she finally wound down, Mark sat on the couch and pulled her down next to him. Remember that meeting I had today? With the important people? Yeah, with the important people. They offered me a job, a really good job. And I said yes. Sophie's eyes widened. Does that mean we're rich? Mark laughed, surprised by the question. No, sweetheart, we're not rich. But we're going to be more comfortable. I'll be home more, regular hours. And you know what else? What? We can get you those new shoes you need, and maybe some new clothes for school. Sophie threw her arms around his neck, careful of his bandaged arm. Really? Really? They sat together on the couch, Mark holding his daughter, feeling the weight of 3 days catch up with him all at once. The fear and violence of Friday, the uncertainty of the weekend, the surreal conversation in Laura Kensington's office, all of it leading to this moment, sitting in their small apartment with his daughter in his arms, knowing that tomorrow would be different from yesterday. That night, after Sophie was asleep, Mark sat at the kitchen table and read through the employment contract one more time. He signed it carefully, his handwriting shakier than usual. Tomorrow he'd scan it and email it back to Patricia. Tomorrow he'd figure out what to wear on his first day. Tomorrow he'd start learning how to be something other than what he'd been. But tonight he was just Mark Ellison, single father, former Marine, accidental hero. Tomorrow he'd be director of corporate security. But tonight, he was exactly who he'd always been. He checked on Sophie one more time before bed, standing in her doorway and watching her sleep the way he did every night. She was sprawled across her twin mattress, one arm hanging off the edge, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin. 8 years old and already so independent, already learning to take care of herself because that's what she'd had to do. Not anymore, Mark thought. Not anymore. He closed her door softly and went to his own room, lying in the darkness and listening to the familiar sounds of their building. Pipes groaning. The couple next door's television. Traffic on the street below. The same sounds he'd fallen asleep to for 5 years. But everything was different now. Everything had changed in the space between a normal Friday morning and a Monday afternoon decision. Mark had stepped forward when he could have stayed back, had chosen the harder right over the easier wrong, and somehow, impossibly, it had led to this. A second chance, a new beginning. A way forward that didn't involve constantly scrambling just to stay afloat. Mark closed his eyes, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt something like hope. It was fragile and tentative, the way hope always is when you've been disappointed too many times. But it was there, real, possible. Tomorrow he'd start figuring out what came next. Tonight, he just let himself feel grateful. For Sophie, for Laura Kensington's decision to stop at a bank on Friday morning, for his own instincts that had pushed him forward when every logical thought said to stay hidden, for all the random chaos that had somehow added up to this moment. Mark fell asleep with the employment contract on his nightstand, his daughter safe in the next room, and the rain still falling softly outside. The storm would pass, the sun would rise, and Mark Ellison would wake up to a world that looked different than it had just 3 days ago. Better. Not perfect, but better. And for now, that was more than enough. Tuesday morning began with an email from Patricia containing enough attachments to make Mark's phone screen blur with file names. New hire paperwork, tax forms, direct deposit authorization, an employee handbook that was 73 pages long. Benefits enrollment forms with options. Mark had never had to consider before because he'd never had real benefits. Dental insurance with different tiers. Vision coverage. Life insurance with Sophie listed as beneficiary, a detail that made Mark's throat tight when he typed her name. He sat at the kitchen table with his second cup of coffee, Sophie already dressed for school and watching morning cartoons, clicking through documents on his phone and trying to absorb information that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. There was a section about professional development opportunities, another about tuition reimbursement for continuing education, a whole paragraph explaining the company's 401k matching program, which Mark read 3 times before he understood that Crestline would literally give him free money just for saving for retirement. His start date was Monday, 6 days away. 6 days to wrap up his old life and prepare for the new one. 6 days to figure out how to be the kind of person who worked in a glass tower instead of cleaning it. Mark replied to Patricia's email confirming he'd received everything, then opened a new message to Diane Peterson. He'd been putting this off since accepting the job, some petty part of him wanting to savor the moment of telling his former supervisor exactly where she could stick her termination paperwork. But that wasn't who Mark was, so he kept it professional, brief. He thanked her for the opportunity to work at Morrison Janitorial, explained that he'd accepted another position, and offered to return his uniform and building access keys at her convenience. Her response came back in less than 5 minutes. Good luck in your future endeavors. 6 words. No acknowledgement of the 3 years Mark had worked there, never missing a shift until Friday. No curiosity about where he was going or why. Just 6 words and a corporate door closing with a bureaucratic click. Mark deleted the email and felt nothing. That part of his life was over. Done. He was moving forward now, into territory that was both terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. Wednesday, Mark took Sophie shopping for new shoes. They went to the discount store because habits die hard, and Mark couldn't quite bring himself to pay full price, even though the signing bonus had already hit his account, $20,000 that looked surreal sitting there in his checking balance. Sophie picked out sneakers with purple laces and lights that blinked when she walked. She wore them out of the store, her old shoes left behind in the box, and spent the entire bus ride home stomping her feet to watch the lights flash. "Everyone at school is going to be so jealous," she said, her face glowing with the particular joy that came from having something new and desirable. Mark watched her and felt the weight of 5 years lift slightly. How many times had he told Sophie they couldn't afford new shoes yet, that the old ones still had some wear left? How many times had she accepted it without complaint because she'd learned too young that complaining didn't change reality? Now, watching her delight in something as simple as sneakers with lights, Mark understood exactly why he'd accepted Laura Kensington's offer. Not for himself. For this. For the ability to give his daughter normal childhood pleasures without calculating the cost against their electric bill. Thursday morning, Mark received a call from Richard Hayes. "Just checking in," Hayes said, his voice friendly but businesslike. "Making sure you have everything you need before Monday." "I think so. Still working through all the paperwork. Don't worry about understanding everything right now. You'll have a full orientation on Monday. It will set you up with a computer and email. HR will walk you through benefits in detail. Your team will be there to meet you at 10. Hayes paused. "I wanted to give you a heads up about something. The bank robbery made the local news, and while they didn't release your name, some reporters have been digging. It's possible your identity might come out. I wanted you to be prepared for that possibility." Mark's stomach dropped. "I don't want to be in the news." "I understand. We've done what we can to protect your privacy, but we can't control everything. If reporters do contact you, you're under no obligation to speak with them. Refer them to our PR department. We'll handle it." After the call ended, Mark sat staring at his phone, anxiety creeping up his spine. He'd been so focused on the job and what it meant for Sophie that he hadn't considered the publicity angle. The last thing he wanted was cameras and questions, people calling him a hero when he'd just been a guy who couldn't walk away from someone in trouble. That afternoon, while Sophie was at school, Mark walked to the Morrison janitorial office to return his uniform. It was a small, dingy space above a convenience store, the kind of place that smelled like old coffee and broken dreams. Diane was there, sitting behind her desk with the same sour expression she always wore, like the world was a personal disappointment. Ellison. She didn't stand, didn't offer to shake his hand, just held out her palm for the keys and uniform. Mark handed them over. "I appreciate the opportunity to work here." "Sure you do." Diane tossed the keys in a drawer. "Where are you going? Security guard somewhere?" "Something like that." She snorted. "Well, good luck. You'll need it. People like you always end up back where you started." Mark could have told her about the job at Crestline Holdings, could have described the salary and the benefits in the office on the 43rd floor, could have watched her expression change when she realized exactly how wrong she was about him. But that would have been petty. So instead, he just nodded, said goodbye, and left. Let Diane Peterson think whatever she wanted. Her opinion had stopped mattering the moment Laura Kensington shook his hand. Friday afternoon, Mark got an unexpected visitor. He was doing laundry in the building's basement when someone knocked on the open door. Mark turned to find Detective Patricia Warren standing there, out of uniform, wearing jeans and a leather jacket. "Detective Warren? Hope I'm not intruding. I tried calling, but you didn't answer." She gestured to his phone sitting on top of the washing machine, volume turned down. "Wanted to give you an update on the bank robbery case." Mark wiped his hands on his jeans. "Did you catch them?" "2 of them. The leader and the one you tackled. Arrested them Wednesday morning at a motel outside the city. 3rd suspect is still at large, but we'll get him." Warren leaned against the doorframe. "They're both being charged with armed robbery, aggravated assault, and a few other charges that'll keep them locked up for a long time. The DA wants to know if you'd be willing to testify at trial." "If I have to, yeah." "Good." That's what I told her. Warren pulled out her notebook, flipped through pages. "The one you tackled, his name's Raymond Porter. Career criminal, multiple priors. He's claiming you used excessive force, says you nearly killed him." Mark's jaw tightened. "He had a knife, was about to stab me." "I know. It's bullshit, and it won't go anywhere. His lawyer's just trying to build a defense. I wanted you to hear it from me first in case it comes up." Warren closed her notebook. Between you and me, Porter's looking at 20 years minimum. He should be grateful you didn't kill him. After Warren left, Mark finished the laundry in silence, her words echoing in his head. Raymond Porter. Now the stocky robber had a name, a history, a future spent behind bars. Mark tried to feel something about that, tried to access whatever emotion he was supposed to have about the man who'd tried to kill him. But there was just numbness, the same kind of emotional distance he developed in combat when thinking too hard about the enemy made you hesitate. Saturday, Mark took Sophie to visit Emma's grave. They hadn't been in a couple months, and Mark felt guilty about that, the way he always did when too much time passed between visits. The cemetery was quiet, peaceful in the way that places of the dead always were. They walked past rows of headstones until they reached Emma's, a simple marker with her name and dates and the phrase, beloved wife and mother. Mark had chosen those words 5 years ago, standing in the funeral home in shock, unable to process that he was picking out his wife's headstone instead of planning their 10th anniversary trip. The funeral director had been kind but efficient, walking Mark through decisions that felt impossible. What kind of casket? What kind of service? What words would define Emma's entire existence in fewer than 10? Sophie knelt in the grass and traced her mother's name with one finger. She'd been 3 when Emma died, old enough to remember fragments but too young to really understand what she'd lost. Now, at 8, she was starting to grasp it, starting to notice that other kids had 2 parents while she only had 1. Starting to ask questions about her mother that Mark did his best to answer, even though every question was a knife in his chest. Mom would be proud of you, Sophie said quietly, for saving that lady. Mark knelt beside his daughter. Your mom would be proud of you, for being brave and kind and smart. Do you think she can see us? From heaven? I don't know, sweetheart. I hope so. They sat together in the grass for a long time, not talking, just being. Mark told Emma about the job, about the changes coming, about how scared he was to mess it all up. He didn't believe in ghosts or signs from beyond, but talking to Emma's headstone was a habit he couldn't break. It helped sometimes, pretending she could hear him, pretending he wasn't navigating this alone. On the way home, Sophie was quiet, her hand small in Mark's as they walked to the bus stop. Finally, she said, Daddy, are we going to move to a new apartment? Maybe eventually. Would you want to? I like our apartment, but the elevator's always broken, and sometimes I hear the neighbors fighting and it scares me. Mark's heart clenched. He'd known the building wasn't ideal, but he'd thought Sophie was okay with it. Apparently, she'd just been doing what she always did, accepting circumstances because that's what kids learn to do when their parents were doing their best and their best barely covered the basics. We'll find somewhere better, Mark promised. Somewhere with a working elevator and quiet neighbors, and maybe a park nearby. Would you like that? Sophie nodded, and they didn't talk about it again. But Mark added it to his mental list of things the new job would fix. Better apartment, better neighborhood, better everything. Sunday evening, Mark stood in front of his closet trying to figure out what to wear for his first day. He'd bought 2 new shirts and a pair of dress pants on Thursday, spending more on clothes than he had in the last 2 years combined. The shirt still had creases from the package, and Mark had learned to iron them using a YouTube video and a $20 iron from Target. The results were acceptable, if not perfect. Good enough for a guy who was still figuring out how to look like he belonged in a corporate office. He laid out the clothes on his bed like a uniform. Dark pants, light blue shirt, his only tie that wasn't stained, black shoes that he'd polished until they reflected light. The bandage on his arm was gone now, the stitches dissolving, leaving behind a pink scar that would eventually fade to white. He'd rolled up his shirt sleeves to hide it initially, but Hayes had told him not to bother. Scars tell stories, the VP had said, and yours is worth telling. Mark wasn't so sure about that, but he'd stopped arguing. If Crestline Holdings wanted to hire a scarred former Marine who'd gotten lucky at the wrong place and time, he wasn't going to talk them out of it. Sophie appeared in his doorway, already in her pajamas, her damp hair from the bath making dark patches on her shirt. You look nervous. I am nervous. But you were a Marine. Marines aren't scared of anything. Mark smiled despite himself. Marines get scared all the time, kiddo. We just do the job anyway. That's the difference. So, tomorrow you'll be scared, but you'll do it anyway? Exactly. Sophie climbed onto his bed, careful not to disturb the laid-out clothes, and hugged him. You're going to be great, Daddy. I know it. Her faith in him was absolute and terrifying. 8 years old and convinced her father could do anything, be anything. Mark hoped she was right. He hoped he wouldn't let her down. That night, sleep came in fits and starts. Mark would doze off, then wake an hour later with his heart racing, anxiety about tomorrow twisting his stomach into knots. He kept thinking about walking into that building on Monday morning, not as a visitor but as an employee. Kept imagining all the ways he could screw it up, all the gaps in his knowledge, all the things he didn't know about corporate culture and office politics and being someone other than the guy who mopped floors after everyone else went home. Around 3 in the morning, Mark gave up on sleep entirely. He got up, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table in the dark, and read through the employee handbook one more time. Dress code, expected conduct, chain of command, performance review processes, all of it surreal and foreign and somehow his new reality. He thought about the men who'd robbed the bank, about Raymond Porter sitting in a cell waiting for trial, about the butterfly effect of choices. If Mark had gone to a different bank that morning, if he'd been 5 minutes earlier or later, if the robbers had chosen a different target, none of this would be happening. He'd still be a janitor, barely scraping by. Sophie would still be wearing shoes 2 sizes too small, and some other customer would have been in that lobby when 3 masked men burst through the doors. But that wasn't what happened. Mark had been there. He'd acted. And now everything was different. The sky outside the kitchen window slowly lightened from black to gray to the pale blue of early morning. Mark watched the sunrise and drank his coffee and tried to quiet the voice in his head that kept insisting this was all a mistake, that he was going to walk into that building and everyone would immediately see that he didn't belong. At 6:30, Sophie's alarm went off, and their normal morning routine began. Breakfast, packing lunch, checking homework. The familiar rhythms helped settle Mark's nerves. This he knew how to do. This was his job, the one he'd been doing for 5 years, the one that mattered more than anything else. He walked Sophie to school, watching her light-up sneakers flash with each step, listening to her chatter about a science project due next week. At the school gate, she hugged him extra tight. "First day," she whispered. "You've got this." "Thanks, kiddo. Have a good day. I'll pick you up at 3:15. Regular schedule now, right? Every day?" "Every day," Mark confirmed, and watched her face light up with a smile that made everything worth it. The bus ride downtown felt longer than usual, probably because Mark was hyper-aware of every minute passing. He arrived at the Crestline Holdings building at 8:45, 15 minutes early because the Marines had trained him that early was on time and on time was late. The same security guards from his interview were at the desk. The older one looked up and did a double take. "Mr. Ellison, you're back." "First day. I work here now." The guard's expression shifted from surprise to respect. "Well, welcome aboard. Go on up." "Go. They're expecting you." The elevator ride to the 43rd floor was familiar now, but no less nerve-wracking. Mark watched the numbers climb and tried to remember how to breathe. The doors opened onto the reception area where Patricia sat at her desk, already on a phone call. She saw Mark and waved, mouthing, "1 minute." Mark stood awkwardly by the elevators until she finished. Then she bounced up with genuine warmth. "Mr. Ellison, welcome. Let me show you to your office. Mr. Hayes wanted me to get you settled before your team meeting at 10. "I have an office?" "Of course you have an office. You're a director." Patricia led him down a different hallway than he'd taken during the interview, this one lined with more offices, some occupied and some empty. She stopped at one about halfway down, Mark's name already on the door in neat lettering. "Here we are. It's not huge, but it's yours." The office was bigger than Mark's entire living room. A desk, a computer, 2 guest chairs, a bookshelf, a window with a view of the city. Mark stood in the doorway, unable to quite process that this space belonged to him. "It will be up in about 15 minutes to get you set up with computer access and email," Patricia continued. "And I put together a welcome packet with all the essentials, building directory, emergency contacts, that kind of thing. Your direct line is on the desk phone. Any questions, just call me. I'm extension 4001. She left, and Mark stepped fully into his office, closing the door behind him. The silence was profound. He'd never worked in a space where he could close a door, where other people's noise and presence weren't a constant backdrop. It felt wrong somehow, like he was pretending to be someone he wasn't. He sat in the chair behind the desk, the leather creaking under his weight. The computer monitor was dark. The desk was empty except for the phone and the welcome packet Patricia had mentioned. On the bookshelf, someone had placed a few generic business books, titles like Leadership Principles and Security Management in the Modern Era. Mark pulled one out, flipped through it, saw charts and graphs and terminology he only vaguely understood. A knock on the door startled him. "Come in," he called, his voice steadier than he felt. Richard Hayes entered, looking exactly as professional as he had during the interview. "Welcome to your first day. How are you feeling?" "Honestly, terrified." Hayes laughed, a genuine sound that eased some of Mark's tension. "Good. If you weren't terrified, I'd be worried. This is a big change, but you're going to do fine." He sat in one of the guest chairs, gestured for Mark to stay seated. "I wanted to talk to you before the team meeting, give you some context about the people you'll be working with." For the next 20 minutes, Hayes walked Mark through his new team. 12 security professionals, all with different specializations and personalities. There was Marcus Chen, former LAPD, who handled physical security systems. Jennifer Rodriguez, ex-Secret Service, who managed executive protection protocols. David Kim, a cybersecurity expert who'd worked for the NSA. On and on, a roster of people with impressive credentials and experience that made Mark feel even more out of his depth. "They're good people," Hayes concluded. "But they've been directionless for the last 6 months since our last director retired. They need leadership. Someone who can make decisions, take responsibility, and create a culture of accountability. That's you." "I've never managed anyone before," Mark admitted. "Leadership isn't about managing. It's about setting the example. You've already proven you can do that." Hayes stood, checked his watch. "Team meeting in 5 minutes. Conference room down the hall. Just be yourself, Mark. That's who we hired." After Hayes left, Mark sat alone in his office for 2 more minutes trying to gather himself. Be yourself. Easy to say. Harder to do when yourself was a janitor playing dress-up in business casual. But Sophie believed in him. Laura Kensington believed in him. Richard Hayes believed in him. Maybe it was time Mark started believing in himself. He stood, straightened his tie, and walked to the conference room. The team was already assembled when Mark entered. 12 people, a mix of ages and backgrounds, all turning to look at him as he walked in. Hayes was there too, standing at the head of the table. He nodded to Mark and gestured to the empty seat beside him. "Everyone, this is Mark Ellison, your new director. Mark, your team." Mark remained standing, looking at each face, seeing the curiosity and the skepticism and the guarded professionalism of people who'd been through leadership changes before and weren't convinced this one would be any different. "I'm not going to lie to you," Mark began, his voice rough but steady. "I don't have an MBA. I haven't worked in corporate security before. 6 days ago, I was a janitor, but I was also a Marine for 8 years. I've been in situations where split-second decisions meant the difference between people living or dying. And I believe that security, real security, isn't about protocols and procedures. It's about keeping people safe. That's what I know how to do. That's what I will do. And I'm going to need all of you to teach me what I don't know, because I'm not too proud to admit there's a lot I don't know." The room was silent for a beat. Then Marcus Chen, the former LAPD officer, leaned back in his chair and smiled. "I think we're going to get along just fine, boss." The meeting continued with introductions and overview presentations that made Mark's head spin. Building security protocols, emergency response procedures, threat assessment frameworks. Marcus and Jennifer and David and 9 others walked him through their specific areas of responsibility. And Mark listened and took notes and asked questions when things didn't make sense. By noon, his brain felt like it had been through a blender, but he also felt something else, a sense of possibility. These weren't just employees. They were a team, his team. And maybe, just maybe, he could actually do this. Lunch was catered in the conference room, sandwiches and salads that were better than anything Mark usually ate. He sat with his team and listened more than he talked, learning about them as people rather than just professionals. Marcus had 3 kids and coached Little League. Jennifer was training for a marathon. David collected vintage video games. Normal people with normal lives who happened to be very good at their jobs. At 2 o'clock, Patricia appeared in the conference room doorway. "Mr. Ellison, Ms. Kensington would like to see you in her office when you have a moment." Mark excused himself and followed Patricia to the CEO's office. Laura was on the phone when he arrived, but she gestured for him to sit. He settled into one of the chairs by her desk and waited, looking out at the city view and trying not to feel like an imposter. Laura finished her call and turned her attention to Mark. "How's your first day going?" "Overwhelming, but good. Good is all we're aiming for right now." She stood and walked around her desk, leaning against it rather than sitting behind it. The gesture put them on equal footing, literally and figuratively. "I wanted to check in personally. Make sure you have everything you need." "Everyone's been great. Your team is incredible." "They're your team now," Laura corrected gently. "And I have faith you'll lead them well." She paused, her expression turning more serious. "I also wanted to thank you again, properly, without the shock and emotion of last week." "Ms. Kensington." "Laura, please, we're going to be working together. First names." "Laura." The name felt strange on his tongue, too informal for someone who owned the building he was standing in. "You've already thanked me. With the job, the signing bonus, all of it. You don't need to keep thanking me." "I disagree. What you did deserves more recognition than a job and a bonus. You gave me my life back, Mark. You gave my daughter her mother. There's no amount of money that can repay that. But I can make sure you have opportunities, resources, support. I can make sure that your life is as good as you made mine by saving it." Mark didn't know what to say to that. The weight of her gratitude was almost uncomfortable. He'd done what any decent person would do, or at least what he hoped any decent person would do. Being praised for basic human decency felt wrong. Laura seemed to sense his discomfort. She smiled, easing the moment. "I'll stop making it awkward. Just know that my door is always open. Literally. You need something, you come to me directly. No red tape, no hierarchy. Understood?" "Understood." "Good. Now go home. It's your first day. Don't stay late trying to prove something. Your daughter will want to hear all about it." Mark left Laura's office and returned to his own, gathering the welcome packet and the stack of documents he'd accumulated throughout the day. At 3 o'clock, he left the building, descended to street level, and started the commute to Sophie's school. The subway was crowded with other workers heading home or to second jobs, and Mark stood holding the overhead rail, swaying with the motion of the train, thinking about how different this felt from his old commute. No physical exhaustion, no smell of cleaning chemicals clinging to his clothes, just mental fatigue and the satisfied tiredness that came from a day of real work. Sophie was waiting at the school gate when Mark arrived, and her face split into a huge grin when she saw him. "How was it? Tell me everything." They walked to the bus stop, and Mark told her about his office and his team and the overwhelming amount of information he'd absorbed. Sophie listened with the fierce attention of someone who genuinely cared, asking questions and making observations that surprised Mark with their insight. "So you're the boss?" she asked as they boarded the bus. "I guess I am." "That's so cool. Mom would be so proud." Those words, simple and heartfelt, settled into Mark's chest and stayed there for the rest of the evening. Through dinner and homework and the bedtime routine, he kept hearing Sophie's voice. Mom would be so proud, and maybe she would be. Maybe Emma was proud, wherever she was, watching Mark stumble through this new life and somehow not fall. That night, after Sophie was asleep, Mark stood in his new office clothes, hanging them carefully for tomorrow. His arm still ached slightly where the bullet had grazed him, a reminder of the choice that had led him here. He touched the scar through his shirt, felt the raised line of healing tissue. One moment, one decision, and everything had changed. Mark turned off the lights and went to bed, exhaustion pulling him under faster than it had in days. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new learning curves, new moments of feeling like he didn't belong. But tonight, he'd survived his first day. He'd shown up, done his best, and somehow convinced a room full of professionals that he deserved to be there. That was enough. For tonight, it was more than enough. The weeks that followed Mark's first day blurred together in a cascade of learning curves and small victories. Each morning he'd drop Sophie at school, watch her light up sneakers flash as she ran toward the building, then take the subway downtown to the glass tower that still didn't quite feel like a place where he belonged. But slowly, incrementally, the foreignness began to fade. His team stopped treating him like an unknown quantity and started treating him like their director. He learned the rhythm of corporate life, the unspoken rules about when to email versus when to call, how to read a room during meetings, when to defer to expertise, and when to make the hard call himself. Marcus Chen became an unexpected ally, the kind of colleague who'd stop by Mark's office at the end of the day with a beer hidden in a paper bag and talk through whatever challenge Mark was wrestling with. Jennifer Rodriguez taught him how to read security reports efficiently, how to spot the critical details buried in pages of technical jargon. David Kim patiently explained cybersecurity protocols in language a former Marine could understand, never once making Mark feel stupid for asking basic questions. By the third week, Mark had implemented his first major change, a new emergency response protocol that drew on his military experience. The team had been skeptical initially, but when they ran the first drill and shaved 4 minutes off their previous response time, the skepticism transformed into respect. Richard Hayes called Mark into his office afterward and said 3 words that meant more than any fancy title. "Well done, son." But it was the small moments that really marked the transformation. The day Mark realized he'd stopped calculating the cost of Sophie's lunch before packing it. The afternoon he bought her a book she wanted without checking his bank balance first. The evening he came home from work mentally tired but not physically destroyed, still had energy to help with homework and read Harry Potter and be present instead of just surviving. Sophie noticed. Kids always noticed. She started drawing pictures of Mark in a tie, labeling them "My Dad the Director" in careful crayon letters. She told her teacher about his new job, came home with stories about show and tell where she'd explained that her father was in charge of keeping people safe. The pride in her voice when she talked about him made Mark's chest ache with love and responsibility in equal measure. 6 weeks into the job, on a gray Thursday afternoon in late November, Patricia buzzed Mark's office. "You have a visitor. Laura Kensington's daughter is here. She'd like to meet you." Mark stood, straightening his tie automatically, a nervous gesture he'd developed. He'd met with Laura several times since starting. Brief check-ins where she'd ask how things were going and offer support if needed. But he'd never met her daughter, the girl whose mother he'd saved, the 12-year-old who'd almost lost her parent the same way Sophie had lost hers. Patricia led a young girl into his office. She had her mother's intelligent eyes and the gangly awkwardness of someone caught between childhood and adolescence. She wore a school uniform, her backpack slung over one shoulder, and she looked nervous. "Mr. Ellison, this is Charlotte." "Charlotte, this is Mr. Ellison." "Hi," Charlotte said, her voice quiet. Then, stronger. "Thank you for saving my mom." The words were simple and devastating. Mark gestured for her to sit, waited until Patricia left and closed the door. He took the other guest chair instead of sitting behind his desk, eliminating the barrier of authority. "You're welcome," Mark said, not sure what else to say. "How are you doing?" "Okay, I guess. Mom told me what happened at the bank. She didn't want to at first, thought it would scare me. But I kept asking, and finally she told me everything." Charlotte's hands twisted in her lap. "She said you got hurt, that you got shot protecting her. Just a graze, nothing serious. But you could have died, and you didn't even know her. You just helped." Charlotte looked up, meeting Mark's eyes directly. "Why? Why did you do it?" It was the same question Mark had been asking himself for 6 weeks. He'd given different answers to different people. Instinct, training, the right thing to do. All true, but none of them quite complete. "I have a daughter too," Mark said finally. "She's 8. Her name is Sophie. and her mom died when she was 3. So when I saw your mom in trouble, all I could think about was that you might lose your mom the way Sophie lost hers. And I couldn't let that happen. Not if I could stop it. Charlotte's eyes filled with tears. She wiped them away quickly, embarrassed. I'm sorry about Sophie's mom. Thank you. I'm glad your mom is okay. They sat in silence for a moment, two people connected by violence and choice and the strange mathematics of fate. Then Charlotte pulled something from her backpack, a card and a purple envelope covered in stickers. I made this for you. Mom said I shouldn't bother you at work, but I wanted to give it to you myself. Mark opened the envelope carefully. The card was homemade, construction paper folded in half, with a drawing of a man and a woman on the front. Inside, in careful handwriting, thank you for being a hero. Thank you for giving me more time with my mom. You saved her life, which means you saved mine too. Love, Charlotte. Mark's throat constricted. He looked at this 12-year-old girl who'd almost become an orphan, who was thanking him for something he'd barely thought about before doing, and felt the weight of what had really happened that Friday morning. He hadn't just saved Laura Kensington, he'd saved Charlotte's mother. He'd preserved a family. He'd prevented a young girl from experiencing the same loss that Sophie carried every day. This is beautiful, Mark managed. Thank you, Charlotte. I'm going to keep this in my office where I can see it. Charlotte smiled, the relief on her face obvious. Mom wants to know if you and Sophie would come to dinner sometime. At our house. She keeps saying she wants to thank you properly, and I want to meet Sophie. I'd like that. I'll talk to your mom about scheduling. After Charlotte left, Mark sat alone in his office, the card on his desk, and let himself feel everything he'd been pushing down for weeks. The fear of that morning, the split-second decision, the aftermath that had brought him here. He'd spent so long trying to move forward, to embrace this new life, that he hadn't really processed the old one ending. The moment when he'd tackled an armed robber and changed the trajectory of multiple lives, including his own. That evening, Mark picked up Sophie from school and took her to the park, even though it was cold and threatening rain. They sat on a bench and Mark told her about Charlotte's visit, about the card, about the dinner invitation. Can we go? Sophie asked immediately. I want to meet her. Is she nice? Does she like Harry Potter? Mark laughed. I don't know if she likes Harry Potter, but yes, we can go. I think it would be good for both of us. Because she almost lost her mom like I lost mine? The perceptiveness of the question caught Mark off guard. Yeah, sweetheart. Exactly like that. Sophie leaned against his side, her head resting on his arm. I'm glad you saved her. I'm glad Charlotte still has her mom. 2 weeks later, on a Saturday evening in early December, Mark and Sophie stood outside a brownstone in one of the city's nicest neighborhoods. The house was 3 stories of brick and ivy, with warm light glowing through curtained windows and a wreath on the door that probably cost more than Mark's monthly rent used to be. Sophie gripped his hand tightly, nervous in the way kids get when entering unfamiliar territory. Mark rang the doorbell, and Charlotte answered almost immediately, as if she'd been waiting by the door. You came! Come in, it's freezing. The interior was exactly what Mark expected. Tasteful furniture, original artwork, hardwood floors that gleamed, but it was also lived in, comfortable. Books stacked on tables, a backpack dumped by the stairs, family photos covering the walls. A home, not just a showplace. Laura appeared from the kitchen wearing jeans and a sweater, her hair down and casual. She looked different outside the office, more relaxed, more real. Mark, Sophie, welcome. Thank you for coming. Dinner was surprisingly easy. Laura had ordered pizza because Charlotte had insisted, saying that fancy food would make everyone uncomfortable. They ate at the kitchen table, Charlotte and Sophie hitting it off immediately over a shared love of books and science. Mark and Laura talked about work and kids and the strange paths life took. There was no awkwardness, no sense of obligation or debt hanging over the evening. Just 2 single parents sharing a meal with their daughters, connected by circumstance but choosing to be connected by something more. After dinner, the girls disappeared upstairs to Charlotte's room, leaving Mark and Laura alone with coffee and the comfortable silence of people who'd been through something together. She talks about you, Laura said, cradling her mug. Charlotte. She asks about you, wants to know how you're doing, if Sophie's okay. I think meeting you helped her process what happened. Made it real, but also survivable. Sophie's the same with you. Asks if you're safe, if you're happy. She worries. Mark paused. She worries because she knows what it's like to lose a parent, and she knows how close you came. I think about that day constantly, Laura admitted. Not the fear, though, that comes sometimes, but the randomness of it. How a decision to stop at the bank could have ended my life. How you being there, at that exact moment, saved it. The odds of all those variables aligning are astronomical. I don't believe in fate, Mark said. Too many years in combat, watching good people die for no reason. But sometimes I wonder if maybe there's something, not fate, just purpose. Things happening for a reason we only understand later. Laura set down her coffee and looked at him directly. I need to tell you something. I've been putting it off because I didn't want you to feel pressured, but you deserve to know. She took a breath. The board of directors wants to recognize you, publicly. They want to do a press release, announce what happened, celebrate your heroism. It would be good PR for the company. Mark's stomach dropped. No, absolutely not. That's what I told them. I said you valued your privacy, that you'd made it clear you didn't want attention, but they're pushing. They feel the company should acknowledge what one of our employees did. I'm not company property to be marketed, Mark said, his voice harder than he intended. What I did had nothing to do with Crestline Holdings. I wasn't even an employee yet. I know, and I've been fighting them on this, but I wanted you to be prepared. They may approach you directly. Laura's expression was apologetic. I'm sorry. This is exactly what I was trying to avoid. Upstairs, they could hear the girls laughing, the sound of normalcy and childhood. Mark focused on that sound, used it to calm the anger rising in his chest. He'd taken this job because it meant stability for Sophie, security they'd never had before. But if the cost was becoming a corporate mascot, having his life and his choices turned into a marketing campaign, he wasn't sure it was worth it. Tell them no, Mark said finally. Tell them I'll resign before I let them turn that day into publicity. You don't have to resign. I'll handle the board. Laura's voice was firm, decisive, the CEO voice. This is my company, and I won't let them exploit you. You have my word. The evening ended with Sophie and Charlotte exchanging phone numbers and promises to hang out again. Mark thanked Laura for dinner, and she thanked him for coming, and they both understood they were thanking each other for much more than food and company. They were acknowledging the bond formed in violence and sustained in its aftermath, the strange friendship between two people who might never have met if Mark had chosen a different bank that Friday morning. The following Monday, Mark was in a security review meeting when Patricia interrupted, her expression apologetic. I'm sorry, but there's someone here to see Mr. Ellison. He says it's urgent. Mark excused himself and found a stranger waiting in his office. The man was younger, maybe 30, wearing an expensive suit and the confident smile of someone used to getting what they wanted. He stood when Mark entered and extended his hand. Mr. Ellison, I'm Bradley Harrison from Harrison Public Relations. I'm here on behalf of Crestline Holdings Board of Directors. Mark didn't shake his hand. I've already told Ms. Kensington I'm not interested in any publicity. I understand your hesitation, but hear me out. Harrison sat without being invited, pulling out a tablet. We're proposing a limited media campaign, a few interviews, a press release, maybe a feature in a business magazine. Nothing invasive. Just acknowledging your heroism and how it reflects the quality of people Crestline employs. I said no. Mr. Ellison, think about what this could do for your career. National recognition. You'd become the face of corporate security, consulting opportunities, speaking engagements. You could write your own ticket. I already have a ticket. It's called Doing My Job and Being Left Alone. Mark stood, opening his office door in a clear dismissal. Tell the board I appreciate their interest, but my answer is no. And if they send anyone else to pressure me, I'll make it very clear through legal channels that I don't consent to having my image or my story used for commercial purposes. Harrison's smile didn't falter. That's unfortunate. The board may view your refusal as uncooperative. Given that you're a new employee, it might affect your position. The threat was barely veiled. Mark felt his temper spike, the cold anger that came from his combat days. He stepped closer to Harrison, using his height and bearing to make a point. Are you threatening my job because I won't let you exploit what happened? I'm simply noting that team players who support company initiatives tend to advance faster than those who don't. Get out of my office now. Harrison left, still smiling, and Mark immediately called Laura's direct line. She answered on the first ring. What happened? Patricia said there was a PR person in your office. Your board sent someone to pressure me into doing publicity. When I refused, he threatened my job. The silence on the other end was arctic. When Laura spoke again, her voice was deadly calm. His name? Bradley Harrison. I'll handle this. Don't worry about your job, Mark. It's secure, but I need to make some calls. Laura hung up and Mark sat at his desk, hands shaking with adrenaline. He'd known the job was too good to be true, known there had to be strings attached, but he'd hoped Laura's protection would be enough. Now he wasn't sure. 20 minutes later, Richard Hayes appeared at Mark's door. Laura wants to see you. Conference room on 45. Mark followed Hayes to an elevator that required a special key card, ascending to the top floor where the board of directors met. The conference room was massive, with a table that could seat 30 people and windows on 3 sides. Laura was there with 3 men in suits, board members whose photos Mark had seen in the lobby. One of them, the oldest with silver hair and a sour expression, was mid-sentence when Mark entered. Simply unreasonable to expect an employee to refuse a reasonable request from... He's not refusing a reasonable request, Laura cut him off. He's refusing to be exploited. There's a difference. She saw Mark and gestured to the seat beside her. Mark, thank you for coming. This is the executive committee of our board. Gentlemen, this is Mark Ellison. The silver-haired man didn't offer to shake hands. Mr. Ellison, I'm James Patterson, board chairman. We need to discuss your unwillingness to participate in company initiatives. Mark looked at Laura, who gave a slight nod. Permission to speak freely. With respect, Mr. Patterson, I was hired to oversee corporate security, not to be a marketing tool. What happened at the bank was personal. It had nothing to do with this company. You're an employee of Crestline Holdings. What you do reflects on us. I wasn't an employee when it happened. I was a customer. And the woman I saved was your CEO, who's made it very clear she doesn't want this publicized either. Mark kept his voice steady, professional. I'm good at my job. My team's performance metrics have improved 20% since I started. I've implemented new protocols that have already prevented 2 security breaches. I'm giving you exactly what you hired me for. But I won't give you my story. That's not for sale. Another board member, younger than Patterson, leaned forward. What if we made it worth your while? A bonus, additional compensation. Not interested. Everyone has a price, Mr. Ellison. Mine is higher than you can pay. Mark stood. If this is a condition of my employment, then I'll resign. But I won't be bought. Not by you, not by anyone. Laura stood as well. Mark isn't resigning because the board is going to drop this ridiculous publicity campaign and let him do the job we hired him to do. She looked directly at Patterson. I've already explained that I support Mark's position fully. If the board overrides me on this, then we'll have a much larger conversation about my role as CEO. The room went silent. Laura had just threatened to quit if they pushed this. And everyone in the room knew that Crestline Holdings couldn't afford to lose their CEO 6 months into her tenure, not over something as trivial as a PR campaign. Patterson's jaw tightened. This conversation isn't over. Yes, it is, Laura said firmly. Mark, you're dismissed. Thank you for your time. Mark left the conference room, his heart pounding. He'd just watched his boss threaten to quit to protect him. The weight of that, the sheer magnitude of what Laura had just risked, made his head spin. That evening, after picking up Sophie and making dinner and going through their normal routine, Mark received a text from Laura. Board backed down. You're safe. Sorry you had to go through that. He replied simply, thank you for standing up for me. Her response came immediately. You saved my life. The least I can do is protect your privacy. December passed in a blur of holiday preparations and security protocols for the company's year-end events. Mark's team worked overtime, ensuring that Crestline Holdings' various holiday parties and client events went smoothly. He was in the office late most evenings, but Sophie understood. She was proud of her father's important job, even if it meant less time together temporarily. On Christmas Eve, Mark took Sophie to visit Emma's grave. They left flowers and told her about the year's changes, about the new job and the new apartment they'd moved into just last week. 2 bedrooms with a working elevator and quiet neighbors, exactly what Mark had promised. Sophie's room had a window that overlooked a small park, and she decorated it with posters and books and all the things 8-year-olds loved. "Do you think Mom knows?" Sophie asked, her breath fogging in the cold air. "About how much better things are?" "I think if she's watching, she's happy for us," Mark said, "and proud of you for being so strong." Christmas morning, Mark woke to find Sophie already up, sitting by the modest tree they'd decorated together. He'd bought her real presents this year: books and art supplies and a new winter coat that wasn't from a thrift store. She opened each gift with the kind of wonder that made everything Mark had been through worth it. "This is the best Christmas ever," Sophie declared, hugging a stuffed dragon she'd asked for. "Even better than when Mom was here." The words were innocent, but they hit Mark like a truck. Sophie didn't mean it cruelly. She was just 8, living in the present, comparing this abundant Christmas to the lean years that had come before. But it reminded Mark that Sophie's memories of Emma were fading, being replaced by new experiences that Emma wasn't part of. It was natural. It was healthy. It was also heartbreaking. "Mom would have loved seeing you this happy," Mark said, pulling Sophie close. That's all she ever wanted. New Year's came and went. Mark spent it with Sophie, watching the countdown on TV and eating popcorn, both of them asleep before midnight. He'd been invited to Crestline's corporate New Year's party, but declined. Work-life balance was something Richard Hayes had stressed during Mark's onboarding, and Mark took it seriously. Sophie came first, always. In mid-January, nearly 4 months after the bank robbery, Mark received a call from Detective Warren. "Wanted to update you on the case. Raymond Porter and James Mitchell both pleaded guilty. 22 years for Porter, 25 for Mitchell. The third suspect is still outstanding, but he'll turn up eventually." "Good," Mark said, feeling only a distant sense of satisfaction. Those men were part of a life that felt increasingly remote, a before time that didn't quite connect to his current reality. "One more thing," Warren added. "Porter wanted me to pass along a message. Said to tell you he was sorry, for what it's worth." Mark thought about that for a long time after the call ended. Sorry. A word that couldn't undo violence but might indicate growth, change, the possibility of redemption. He didn't forgive Porter. Couldn't forgive someone who'd been willing to kill an innocent woman. But he could acknowledge the apology and let it be. That was enough. February brought Sophie's 9th birthday. Mark threw her a party at their new apartment, inviting her school friends and Charlotte, who'd become Sophie's unofficial big sister over the past months. Laura came too, bringing a gift and staying to help supervise the chaos of 9-year-olds hopped up on cake and ice cream. After the other kids left and Charlotte was helping Sophie open presents, Laura and Mark stood in the kitchen cleaning up. "She's a great kid," Laura said. "You've done an amazing job with her." "I've done my best. Some days that's not much." "Your best is more than most people's best." Laura paused, then said carefully, "I wanted to ask you something. Charlotte's been asking if Sophie could come on our spring break trip. We're going to Disney World. It would be nice for Charlotte to have company, and Sophie would have a blast." Mark's first instinct was to refuse. He couldn't accept more from Laura, couldn't let the debt between them grow any larger. But then he looked at Sophie, laughing at something Charlotte said, her face bright with happiness. And he remembered what Emma had told him. What matters, not what's easy. "Let me pay for Sophie's portion," Mark said. "Flights and tickets. I can afford it now." "Done," Laura agreed, though Mark suspected she'd find a way to cover the costs anyway. Spring came, and with it the Disney trip that Sophie talked about for weeks in advance. Mark put her on the plane with Laura and Charlotte, watching through the airport window as they taxied away, feeling the familiar anxiety of being separated from his daughter. But Sophie was safe. Charlotte was a good kid. Laura would protect them both. He had to learn to let go a little, to trust that the world wouldn't always take from him. The week Sophie was gone, Mark threw himself into work. He was overseeing a major security upgrade across all Crestline properties, a project that required coordination with contractors and vendors and about 17 different departments. It kept him busy enough that he didn't spend every minute missing his daughter. On Wednesday of that week, Richard Hayes called Mark to his office. "Sit down. I have some news." Mark sat, bracing himself. Good news or bad, Hayes's tone gave nothing away. "The board met yesterday. They want to promote you to VP of Security Operations. It comes with a raise, more responsibility, and a seat at executive meetings." Hayes smiled. "It's well-deserved, Mark. You've exceeded every expectation." Mark let the words sink in. VP. Another step up the ladder he hadn't even known he was climbing 6 months ago. What about the publicity thing? Is this contingent on... No strings. They backed off that completely after Laura's threat. This is purely based on your performance. Hayes slid a folder across his desk. "New contract. Take it home, review it, let me know." That evening, Mark sat in his quiet apartment and opened the folder. The salary figure made him blink and read it twice. With this promotion, he'd be making more in a year than he'd made in the previous 5 years combined. Sophie could go to any college she wanted. They could buy a house, save for the future. All the securities that had seemed impossible were now within reach. He called Sophie at the hotel. She answered breathless and excited, talking about the rides she'd been on and the characters she'd met and how Charlotte had won her a stuffed Mickey Mouse at a game. "I miss you, Daddy, but this is so fun." "I miss you too, kiddo. Having a good time?" "The best time ever. Thank you for letting me come." After they hung up, Mark sat holding his phone and feeling the strange duality of his life. 6 months ago, he couldn't afford new shoes for his daughter. Now she was at Disney World while he reviewed a contract that would make them financially secure. The transformation was so complete, so total, that sometimes Mark had to remind himself it was real. He thought about that Friday morning in October, the 3 men with guns, the woman in the navy suit, the split-second decision that had changed everything. If he'd stayed behind that column, if he'd calculated the odds and chosen survival over intervention, if he'd been anyone other than who he was, a man who couldn't walk away from someone in trouble. But he had intervened. He had saved Laura. And in doing so, he'd saved himself and Sophie too. Not from physical danger, but from the slow, grinding poverty that eroded dignity and hope. He'd given them both a future that looked nothing like the past. Sophie came home from Disney World with a suitcase full of souvenirs and stories that lasted for days. She made Mark watch the videos Charlotte had taken, showed him pictures of herself with princesses and on roller coasters, her face glowing with joy in every frame. This was what childhood should look like, Mark thought. Not worrying about money or food or whether your dad would come home from his night shift. Just magic and wonder and the certainty that you were loved. In April, Mark accepted the VP promotion. There was a small ceremony in the main conference room, the executive team gathering to congratulate him, Laura shaking his hand and saying quietly, "You've earned this, every bit of it." That evening, Mark took Sophie out to dinner at a nice restaurant, the kind of place they never could have afforded before. They sat at a table with cloth napkins and multiple forks, and Sophie tried to act grown up, holding her water glass with both hands and speaking in what she probably thought was a sophisticated voice. "I'm proud of you, Daddy," she said seriously. "You're really important now." "I was always important," Mark corrected gently. "Because I'm your dad. That's the most important thing I'll ever be. But now you're important to other people too, that's different." She was right, of course. His role had expanded beyond just father. He was a leader now, someone people depended on, someone who made decisions that affected lives. It was heavy sometimes, that responsibility. But it was also fulfilling in ways his old job never had been. May came, and with it the anniversary of Emma's death. 5 years. Half a decade since Mark had become a single father, since his world had narrowed to survival, and Sophie in the grinding work of getting through each day. He took the day off, something he never could have done at Morrison Janitorial, and spent it with Sophie at the cemetery. They brought flowers, told Emma about their year, about all the changes and improvements. Sophie talked to her mother's headstone with the ease of a child who'd done this many times, updating Emma on school and friends and the upcoming summer vacation. Mark mostly listened, adding details here and there, feeling the familiar ache of loss that never quite went away. "Mom would like our new apartment," Sophie said confidently. "It has a dishwasher. You always said she wanted a dishwasher." "She would love it," Mark agreed. "She'd love seeing you so happy." On the drive home, Sophie was quiet, processing. Finally, she said, "Do you think you'll ever get married again? To someone like Ms. Kensington?" Mark nearly drove off the road. "What? Where did that come from?" "Charlotte says her mom likes you. Not like, but she respects you. And you're both single parents. It makes sense." "Sophie, Laura is my boss, that's all. We're friends because of what happened, but that's it." "Okay," Sophie said, clearly unconvinced. "But if you did like someone, I wouldn't mind. I want you to be happy too." The conversation stuck with Mark for days. He hadn't thought about dating since Emma died, hadn't had the time or energy or desire. His whole life had been Sophie and work and survival. But now, with stability and security, the possibility existed. Not with Laura, obviously. That would be inappropriate on about 17 different levels. But maybe eventually, with someone. The thought was strange and uncomfortable and not entirely unwelcome. Summer arrived, and with it Sophie's school break. Mark arranged his schedule to have more flexible hours, working from home 2 days a week so he could spend time with Sophie. They went to the park, visited museums, took a weekend trip to the beach. Normal family activities that Mark had once thought were reserved for people with more money and less struggle. In July, nearly 9 months after the bank robbery, Mark's team successfully prevented a serious security breach at one of Crestline's data centers. A former employee had attempted to access the building after hours, and Mark's new protocols caught it immediately. The response was textbook perfect, the individual apprehended before any damage could be done. Laura called Mark into her office the next day to congratulate him personally. "This is exactly why we hired you," she said. "You think like someone who's been in actual danger. You understand that security isn't theoretical. It's life and death." "Just doing my job," Mark said, the automatic response. "Stop," Laura said, not unkindly. "You always do that. Minimize your contributions. Take credit when you've earned it, Mark. It's okay to be proud of what you've accomplished." Her words stayed with him as he returned to his office. Was he proud? He'd spent so long just trying to survive that pride felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. But maybe it was time to acknowledge that he'd done more than survive. He'd thrived. He'd taken an impossible situation and turned it into something good. He'd given Sophie a better life. He'd built a career. He'd proven that one moment of courage could ripple forward into a completely different future. In August, Charlotte started high school and Sophie started 4th grade. The two girls stayed close despite the age gap, Charlotte taking her big sister role seriously, Sophie looking up to her with obvious admiration. Laura and Mark fell into an easy friendship, grabbing coffee occasionally when their schedules aligned, talking about their daughters and the challenges of single parenthood. It was during one of these coffee meetings that Laura said, "I've been thinking about that day. The bank. And I realized something. You didn't just save my life. You saved who I am. If I'd died, Charlotte would have grown up without a mother. She would have been shaped by that loss the way Sophie was shaped by losing Emma. You prevented that. You gave Charlotte the chance to grow up whole." Mark didn't know what to say. The weight of what Laura was describing was enormous, the butterfly effect of his choice extending further than he'd fully comprehended. "I think about what Sophie lost," Mark said finally. "Every day. And I'm glad Charlotte didn't have to lose the same thing. That's enough for me." September came, marking 1 year since the robbery. Mark woke that Friday morning, dropped Sophie at school, and took the subway downtown the same way he'd done hundreds of times now. But today, he detoured past Crestline Bank, the scene of the event that had changed everything. The building looked normal, mundane. People went in and out conducting ordinary business. There was no plaque or marker indicating that violence had occurred there. Just another bank on another street in a city full of both. Mark stood outside for a few minutes, remembering. The fear, the gunfire, the choice. Then he turned and walked to work, leaving the memory behind but carrying its consequences forward. That evening, Laura called. "I know what today is. How are you doing? Fine. It feels like it happened to someone else now. I know what you mean. Sometimes I wonder if I dreamed it. Laura paused. Listen, I wanted to do something to mark the anniversary. Nothing public, just a small dinner. You, me, the girls. Charlotte wants to celebrate that we're all here, all okay. Would you come? Yeah, Mark said. We'd like that. The dinner was at Laura's house, casual and comfortable. They ordered Chinese food and ate in the living room, the four of them sharing stories and laughter. At one point, Charlotte and Sophie disappeared upstairs, leaving Mark and Laura alone with the leftovers and fortune cookies. Laura cracked hers open and read, "New opportunities will present themselves soon." She smiled. Bit late for that. The opportunity already presented itself a year ago in the form of a Marine who couldn't mind his own business. I prefer couldn't walk away from someone in trouble, Mark said, opening his own fortune. Good things come to those who wait. He snorted. I think I've done enough waiting. You've done more than wait. You've built something. A life, a career, a future for Sophie. You should be proud. There was that word again. Proud. Mark turned it over in his mind, testing the weight of it. Was he proud? Of surviving? Of providing for his daughter? Of taking a chance when one was offered? I'm grateful, Mark said finally. Proud feels too big. But grateful, yeah. I'm grateful every day. Then I'm grateful too, Laura said softly. For you, for what you did, for the year we've both had because of it. Upstairs, they could hear the girls laughing, the sound of normalcy and safety and childhood preserved. Mark listened and thought about all the moments that had led to this one. Emma's death, the years of struggle, the Friday morning in October, the choice to act instead of hide. Each moment a domino falling, creating the pattern that became his life. October arrived, and with it Mark's one-year anniversary at Crestline Holdings. Richard Hayes took him to lunch at an expensive steakhouse, the kind of place Mark never would have entered before this job. Over medium-rare ribeye and scotch, Mark was still learning to appreciate. Hayes told him about the next phase of his career. We're expanding internationally, new offices in London and Singapore. We need someone to oversee global security operations. The board wants you. Mark set down his fork. That would mean travel, a lot of it. Some, yes, but mostly coordination from here. You'd build and manage teams in each location, but your home base would still be the U.S. Hayes leaned back. It's a big step. Take time to think about it. Talk to Sophie. But Mark, you're ready for this. You've proven that over and over. That evening, Mark discussed it with Sophie over dinner. She listened seriously as he explained what the new role would mean, the occasional travel, the increased responsibility. Would you be gone a lot? She asked. Maybe a week every few months? Less if I can manage it. Sophie thought about it, chewing her pizza carefully. I think you should do it. You're really good at your job, Daddy, and I'm old enough to stay with Mrs. Patterson or Charlotte when you travel. You sure? I'm sure. As long as you promise to call me every day when you're gone. Every single day, Mark promised. He accepted the position the following week. Director of Global Security Operations. The title felt absurd, like someone playing dress-up in their parents' clothes. But the work was real, and Mark threw himself into it with the same focus he'd brought to every challenge since leaving the Marines. He traveled to London in November, spending a week setting up new protocols and interviewing potential team members. He called Sophie every evening, listening to her describe her day, her voice a tether to home. December brought the holidays again, the second Christmas in their new life. This one was even better than the last, Sophie old enough to appreciate not just the presents, but the security behind them. The knowledge that they were okay, that her father's job was stable, that their future was secure. On Christmas Eve, they visited Emma's grave as they always did. Mark told his wife about the promotion, about Sophie's progress in school, about the life they'd built on the foundation of her loss. I wish you could see her, he said quietly. She's so much like you, smart and brave and kind. You'd be so proud. Sophie added, I'm taking care of Daddy, Mom, like you asked me to. We're taking care of each other. The year turned again. bringing 2026 and new challenges and opportunities. Mark continued to grow in his role, his reputation in the security industry expanding beyond Crestline. He was invited to speak at conferences, to write articles for trade publications, to consult on security projects. The janitor who'd tackled a bank robber had become an expert in his field, though few people outside Crestline knew about his origin story. In March, Detective Warren called with final news about the bank robbery case. The third suspect had been arrested in Mexico and extradited back to face charges. All three men were now in prison, their chapter in Mark's story finally closed. Mark thanked Warren for the update and hung up, feeling only a distant sense of closure. That part of his life was over. He'd moved on. Sophie turned 10 in February, double digits that made Mark feel ancient. She was growing up fast, already showing signs of the teenager she'd become. She had friends and interests and a confidence that Mark envied. She knew she was loved, knew she was safe, knew her father would move heaven and earth for her. That knowledge gave her a foundation Emma's death had threatened to destroy. In April, Laura was named CEO of the Year by a major business magazine. The article featured her turnaround of Crestline Holdings, the company's growth under her leadership, her vision for the future. There was a small mention of the bank robbery, carefully worded to protect Mark's privacy, noting only that an employee had prevented a tragedy and that the CEO was committed to security and safety. Mark read the article in his office and felt that familiar pride-gratitude hybrid. Laura had kept her promise. She'd protected him while still acknowledging what happened. The article didn't name him, didn't detail the event, just noted it and moved on. Perfect. That evening, Laura texted him. "Thank you for letting me mention it. I know you value your privacy." "You earned that recognition," Mark replied. "The robbery was just one day. You've done amazing things since." "We both have," she responded. Summer came again, and with it Sophie's fifth-grade year ending. She'd grown tall, almost to Mark's shoulder now, her child's face beginning to show hints of the young woman she'd become. They took a real vacation that year, flying to California to visit Emma's parents for the first time since the funeral. Sophie barely remembered them, but they embraced her with tears and love, marveling at how much she'd grown. Mark's father-in-law pulled him aside during the visit. "Emma would be so proud of you, son. Raising Sophie alone, building a career, staying strong, that's not easy." "Nothing about it has been easy," Mark admitted, "but it's been worth it." September brought another anniversary, 2 years since the robbery. Mark didn't visit the bank this time. He'd moved past needing that physical reminder. The event lived in his memory and his scar, but it didn't define him anymore. He was more than the man who'd tackled a robber. He was a father, a VP, a friend, a survivor. The robbery was part of his story, but not the whole story. October came, bringing his 2-year work anniversary at Crestline. The company threw a small celebration, his team gathering in the conference room with cake and bad jokes and genuine affection. Mark looked around at these people he'd come to know and care about, thought about how 2 years ago he'd been terrified of leading them, and felt that elusive pride Laura kept telling him he'd earned. "Speech," Marcus called out, and others joined the chant. Mark stood, uncomfortable with the attention, but willing to give them this. 2 years ago, I walked into this building convinced I didn't belong here. Convinced I was a fraud who'd gotten lucky and would be found out any day. But you all taught me something. You taught me that belonging isn't about where you start. It's about what you do with where you land. And I landed here, with all of you, and you made me better, made me into someone who deserves to lead this team. So thank you. For your patience, your expertise, your friendship. You're the best team I could ask for." The applause was genuine, and Mark felt his throat tighten with emotion he didn't quite know how to process. These people respected him, valued him, saw him as more than his past or his mistakes or his limited education. They saw him as their director, their leader, their colleague. That night, Mark sat with Sophie after bedtime stories, her room dark except for her nightlight shaped like a moon. She was almost too old for bedtime stories now, but they both pretended she wasn't, unwilling to let go of this ritual. "Daddy?" Sophie's voice was sleepy. Are you happy? Yeah, sweetheart, I am. Are you? Really happy. Happier than I remember being since Mom died. She yawned. I think Mom would be happy too, that we're happy. After Sophie fell asleep, Mark stood in her doorway the way he'd done countless times over the past 7 years, watching his daughter breathe, feeling the weight and wonder of fatherhood. All those years of struggle, all those nights wondering if he was doing enough, if love could substitute for security, if Sophie would grow up resenting what they didn't have. But she hadn't grown up resentful. She'd grown up strong and kind and grateful. She knew what it meant to struggle and to overcome. She'd learned resilience not from lectures, but from watching her father survive and persist and eventually thrive. Those lessons were more valuable than any privilege money could buy. Mark closed Sophie's door and walked to his own room, thinking about the strange mathematics of fate. A bank robbery, a split-second decision, a CEO who believed in paying debts, all of it adding up to a life Mark barely recognized as his own. But it was his. He'd earned it through courage he didn't know he possessed, through choices he'd made in the moment when calculation wasn't possible. He thought about Raymond Porter in prison, about Charlotte growing up with her mother, about Laura leading a company with compassion and strength, about Sophie sleeping peacefully down the hall. All the lives touched by that Friday morning, all the futures changed by violence and intervention and the aftermath of both. Mark got ready for bed, his routine familiar and comfortable. He brushed his teeth, set his alarm, checked his phone one last time. There was a message from Laura, sent just minutes ago. 2 years since you changed my life. Thank you for everything, Mark, for saving me, for being my friend, for proving that good people still exist in this world. He replied simply, thank you for giving me a chance, for believing I was more than my circumstances, for the life Sophie and I have now. Her response came quickly. You were always more than your circumstances. I just gave you the opportunity to show it. Mark set his phone aside and lay in the darkness, listening to the quiet sounds of their apartment. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic, the peaceful breathing of his daughter sleeping safely down the hall. Normal sounds. Beautiful sounds. 2 years ago, he'd been a janitor with an overdue electric bill, standing in a bank line, thinking about Sophie's 2 small shoes. Now he was a VP with a secure future, living in a good apartment, thinking about Sophie's college fund. The transformation was complete and total, built on a foundation of violence and choice and one woman's decision to turn gratitude into opportunity. Mark closed his eyes and felt something he'd spent most of his adult life chasing. Not happiness exactly, though that was part of it. Not pride, though he was learning to accept that too. What he felt was peace. The certainty that he'd done right by Sophie, by Emma's memory, by the second chance he'd been given. The knowledge that when his moment came, when choice compressed into action, he'd chosen the harder right instead of the easier wrong. And that choice had saved more than Laura's life. It had saved his own. Pulled him out of the grinding poverty that eroded hope and dignity. Given Sophie a childhood defined by security instead of scarcity. Created a future that bore no resemblance to the past except in the lessons learned from it. Mark fell asleep thinking about tomorrow. About the security review he had scheduled. About Sophie's parent-teacher conference next week. About the trip to London he'd need to make next month. Ordinary concerns of an ordinary life, made extraordinary by how different it was from what had come before. The bullet scar on his arm had faded to white, barely visible now unless you knew to look for it. But Mark knew it was there. A reminder of the morning everything changed, of the woman whose life he'd saved and who'd saved his life in return, though in a different way. Of courage and consequence and the strange paths that led from survival to thriving. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm. Inside, Mark Ellison slept peacefully, a father and a friend and a leader, defined not by where he'd started, but by who he'd chosen to be when the choice mattered most. The janitor was gone. The hero was a distant memory. What remained was just a man who'd done the right thing and reaped rewards he'd never expected. And sometimes, Mark thought as sleep pulled him under, sometimes that was enough. Sometimes the right choice at the right moment could ripple forward into a completely different life. Sometimes courage wasn't about seeking glory, but about acting when action was needed, regardless of cost. He'd paid the cost that Friday morning, and he'd been paid back 1,000-fold in all the days that followed. That was the real miracle. Not the violence or the heroism, but the ordinary grace of a life rebuilt from a moment of extraordinary courage. Mark's last thought before sleep claimed him completely was of Sophie's face that morning, bright with confidence and joy, waving goodbye at the school gate with her light-up sneakers flashing in the sun. That image, more than any promotion or salary or recognition, was proof that he'd done something right. He'd saved a stranger, and in doing so, he'd saved his daughter's future and his own soul. That was legacy enough for any man. The story that began with gunfire and terror had ended with peace and security and the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived. Mark Ellison had started as a struggling single father and become a successful professional, but more importantly, he'd remained who he'd always been at his core, a man who couldn't walk away when someone needed help. And that, in the end, made all the difference.